Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you all hear me? All right, great. Welcome to the public hearing of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Richard Bury. I have the honor of serving as our chair. We are here as New York celebrates our 400th anniversary to take a fresh look at the city's governing charter. Our goal is to ensure that New York City remains a cradle of opportunity, as it was for my parents when they immigrated from Panama to New York City some 60 years ago, and to explore how we can revise the charter to make it a more effective tool for building the inclusive and affordable city that New Yorkers deserve. We have the responsibility to review the entire charter and suggest changes for the voters' consideration. Only if the voters agree to those changes at an election would any changes to the charter go into effect. I know that I speak for my fellow commissioners when I say that we are committed to hearing from the broadest spectrum of New Yorkers and to pursuing the best ideas we can find. This is just one of many public hearings across every borough to hear ideas from experts, from community leaders, from elected officials, and indeed from any member of the public who wishes to testify. And very importantly, this is an independent commission. So in making our recommendations to the city voters, we are bound only by our judgment and our values. We will pursue ideas regardless of who proposed them and regardless of who supports them. Joining me in this task are 12 other commissioners, some of whom are attending virtually: our Vice Chair, Sharon Greenberger, our Secretary, Leila Bozorg, Grace Bonilla, Shams DeBaron, Anita Lermont, Dr. Lizette Nieves, Anthony Richardson, Julie Samuels, Senator Diane Savino, Carl Weisbrod, Valerie White, and Catherine Wild. Although, as I said, we will be considering the entire charter, the commission is looking in particular at the charter's approach to housing and planning. From my perspective, there is no more urgent challenge for this body to take up. As everyone here understands and knows, the city is in the midst of a profound affordability crisis. For millions of low-income New Yorkers, housing costs are the central struggle of their lives. For millions more, especially low-income New Yorkers, our housing crisis limits where New Yorkers can live and therefore limits what schools they can attend, where they can work, the quality of the air they breathe, whether their families can stay together. These challenges will be the focus of this hearing, but of course, testimony on any topic related to the charter is always welcome. So before we dive in, let me say a few words about how this hearing will unfold. We'll begin by hearing from members of the public who have signed up, and then from those who are attending virtually. We will keep you to a strict 3 minutes. We ask you to try to time yourself. I will also be relatively aggressive, but hopefully not rude in keeping to that 3 minutes. We'll call 2 or 3 people at a time to the panel. We'll hear from all 3 of you, and then once we've heard from the panel, we'll open it up to questions for the entire panel from the commission. And I'll ask my fellow commissioners to hold any testimony until the entire panel, hold any questions until the entire panel has finished their testimony. If you are not here in person but wish to testify virtually, there is a form online. You can find it at the meeting page for this meeting at our website, which is found at nyc.gov/charter. You click on the meetings tab, then select this hearing, select the Manhattan hearing, and we will also drop a link to the sign-up form in the chat if you're already online. And the last thing I'll say is that we will do our best to hear from everyone, but this meeting is scheduled to end until 8 p.m. In the event that we do not get to your testimony this evening, just know there are many ways to submit testimony. You can submit it on the website we just described, nyc.gov/charter. You can also find out about other commission hearings there. You can also submit written testimony via email at any time to chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. That's chartertestimony@citycharter.nyc.gov. All the hearings are live streamed, and of course, all of our hearings are public. And you can also watch any prior hearing online. They're all archived online. So before we begin, I would like to ask for a motion from my fellow commissioners to approve the minutes from both our March 4th meeting and our April 9th meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the minutes are adopted. And with that, we'll move on to our testimony. We're going to start with Minority Leader. Sorry, this is where glasses help. We're going to start with Majority Leader Farias. Please come and testify. Thank you. I have distance glasses and reading glasses. I only have my distance glasses with me.
I know I'm in the majority. Begin?
Yes, please. Thank you so much.
Great. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Amanda Farias, and I proudly serve as the majority leader of the New York City Council, and I get to represent District 18 in the Bronx. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the critical topic of housing and land use. New York City is facing a housing crisis that demands bold, smart solutions. As we consider changes to the charter, we must protect and strengthen the tools that allow communities to meaningfully shape their futures. Chief among them is the City Council's role in the ULURP process. The charter gave the council land use authority to correct a long history of top-down decisions that disenfranchised Black and Brown communities, concentrated poverty, and deepened racial segregation. While we have made progress, our neighborhoods remain deeply unequal. Many communities, particularly in the Bronx, still lack access to affordable housing, public transit, and critical infrastructure. That is why local leadership must remain central to any conversation about land use. As council members, we are the closest level of government to the people. We don't just represent our neighborhoods, we live in them. We see firsthand the challenges our constituents face, and we are the best positioned to balance the needs of developers, tenants, homeowners, and businesses alike. That is what makes our role in the ULURP process so valuable. We help mediate divergent interests and forge compromises that make development possible while ensuring that our communities are not left behind. The results speak for themselves. Since 2022, this council has approved land use applications that will produce over 120,000 homes, including nearly 29,000 from private applications, more than half of which are affordable. That level of affordability would not have happened without council advocacy. Beyond housing, the council has secured billions, with a B, of dollars in public and private investments, from major neighborhood rezonings to community benefits like childcare centers, job training, and cultural spaces. An excellent example of the leverage that ULURP provides to local communities was the Bronx Metro North Area Neighborhood Plan that passed in the City Council last summer. The project is slated to bring 4 new train stations to the East Bronx, including the Parkchester Van Ness station in my own community. Alongside a brand new train station, this project will bring housing, jobs, and other amenities. My office worked closely with council planning and land use to create multiple community engagement sessions where we had meaningful conversations with our neighbors. Through the community engagement in the ULURP process, we received what council would bring to the negotiating table, which enabled me to secure nearly $195 million for District 18 alone, in a nearly $500 million deal with the city. Critical investments to address longstanding infrastructure issues with upgrades. Can I have additional time?
Yeah.
Thank you. Critical investments to address longstanding infrastructure issues with upgrades for water management and flood-prone areas, millions of dollars in renovations to our local playgrounds, upgrades to schools in the area, and a full study of the surrounding area for safer streets, and 2,000 units of new housing that includes open plaza concepts, community spaces, and capital upgrades for the existing Parkchester condominiums. Despite claims to the contrary, ULURP is not the bottleneck. The real delays happen in the pre-certification phase, where applications can sit for years in environmental review, a process over which the council has no control over. And even after ULURP, many approved projects wait years for HPD financing. If we want to speed up housing, we need to focus on fixing those parts of the pipeline, not gutting council oversight. Some argue that taking the council out of ULURP would depoliticize land use. But politics does not appear when you centralize power, it becomes less accountable. The mayor, borough presidents, and agency heads are all political actors too. Removing council members from this process would reduce transparency, silence local voices, and concentrate powers in ways that risk further marginalizing working class communities. We have already seen this happen. For example, in 2022, there were 111 recommendations in the mayor's 2022 Get Stuff Built report, which was a result in the Building and Land Use Approval Streamlining Task Force. The council has not had an update from the mayor on those recommendations since 2023, including more than 20 improvements to the CEQR process, which is a notoriously cumbersome part of the pre-certification process. The administration could heed its own advice and recommendations in 2022 and make several meaningful changes to improve the building and land use approval process without significant changes to the charter. If we want to move this system, let's focus on real solutions. We should increase community education around land use, streamline the pre-ULURP process to create a more inclusive opportunities for housing insecure residents to participate in public review. We should also recognize that the loudest voices in these processes are not always the most representative, and find ways to elevate those most in need of affordable housing. Charter reform should be about empowering communities, not disempowering them. It should reflect our shared values, equity, transparency, and meaningful engagement. The City Council's role in land use is essential to advancing those goals, and I urge you to preserve it. Lastly, I'd like to briefly speak to you about the importance of our communities and the continuity of their success in development, budgetary allocations, capital investments, and civic engagement. I know you've heard from one council member already on this, but extending New York City Council term limits to allow for a third term is necessary and timely change to the city charter, especially for the current legislative body. As the city faces increasingly complex challenges from housing and climate resiliency to economic recovery and public safety, it's more important than ever to ensure continuity in leadership and governance. A third term would allow council members to see long-term projects and community-driven initiatives through to completion, providing much-needed consistency and stability for constituency. When I entered the council, I had far too many stalled projects in schools, senior centers, and local infrastructure, all with budget gaps that could not continue being implemented due to not being fully funded. Moreover, a longer legislative horizon strengthens the council's ability to serve as an effective check on the mayoral administration, offering a more balanced distribution of power and avoiding the destabilizing effect of concurrent mass turnover across branches of government. This is about good governance, accountability, and ensuring that progress isn't lost to term limits that work against the city's long-term interests. This is about the stabilization of our institution. I appreciate your time listening to my testimony and the extended time allotted to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leader. Any questions from the panel? Catherine?
Hi, council member. When citywide interests conflict with local interests, and this, we're not really talking about a situation in your district, but we're talking about a situation where protectionist interests in a district conflict with something that the city desperately needs, like affordable housing. How would you suggest that we try and deal with the council member deference issue?
I think council member deference is always an interesting concept that comes up. It is something that really we are unable to mandate in any way, as it is amongst relationships among members. I do think what we've been driving in the city right now is the fair chance for housing, right? Making sure that every district is doing their own allotment of building, of development, of affordable housing, of cooperative housing, just of housing opportunity throughout the city. I think if we continue to move in that direction where we're looking at who's building and at what rate and at what amounts, where we can be able to redistribute and have those, more important conversations in different districts with who needs to be able to take on some of the development. I do think that a part of the dialogue always needs to happen around what neighborhoods can take what capacity and what type of development. I think that's a real conversation that we consistently have every single time a ULURP application comes in front of us. We're always consistently trying to look at what does the fabric of that community look like? Can a 6-story building go there, or can we push for a 10, or is it better to be a 4-story? I mean, we're consistently having that dialogue, and I think That is a huge driver in even amongst the body itself and supporting the member deference concept in that way, because the dialogue amongst members is what's really driving how folks can push further or even help communicate outward to communities. But without the education piece going into community boards, CECs, the precinct councils, people understanding land use themselves and what it means to build and what our equal responsibility we have across the city to add to the housing stock and to answer for the housing crisis. That's really the starting point that we need to push within communities and within the council.
Councilman, if I could follow up on that question, and I definitely appreciate the sentiment, but in some ways, the question is also about how you manage it in your district, but as we've said, how it's managed citywide. And we've heard compelling testimony from some developers. They will not even propose projects in certain districts because of anticipated opposition from local council leadership. We've heard from developers of smaller developers that the process, not only the pre-certification process, but the ULURP process itself is so onerous that they have no ability to, a very limited ability to pursue projects because they don't have the capital or time, particularly for smaller projects, to move forward. And so even, and I'm sorry if the question's repetitive, but I guess I would ask, even understanding the value of having local leadership who understand the community, both drive what development happens in their district, but also use that power to lever things like affordable housing, other needs. In some ways, I'm trying to understand what you would recommend to drive different action in other districts where council leaders might not be as open to those good faith negotiations that we need to have affordable housing, not just in some districts. So the other testimony we've seen very starkly is that housing development you described is not happening citywide. It's happening in a portion of the city.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is a recent example from one of my colleagues, Councilmember Narcisse, who negotiated a deal in her community with a developer that has now turned that affordable housing project into a shelter. So I think there are a lot of gaps within the system, like the agency policy itself, where we can put some stoppages to make sure that the housing that we're actually putting people through in terms of a ULURP process is actually coming out in implementation. I think to couple with that and to support that, the looking at different ways where the city can either expand bonding capacity to expand the amount of closings we have every year. I think we do have to be a little bit more innovative on how many closings HPD can do, for example, even looking at their term sheets and redeveloping them, which I know is something that we are consistently communicating with HPD on. There's a multitude of facets that we have in front of us that just quite aren't working right now, and no one is taking a deep look into on how to preliminarily say the system can be better. I gave some solutions here, and I'll make sure to put this testimony in the record too and written, but we have agencies that aren't quite functioning at their best, and it's not for a lack of trying, and it's not for the lack of the efforts being made out of those leaders, but there is capacity issues, there's closing issues, there is bonding issues that I think the city can take time to look into more deeply, other than this one component of removing community's voice and council's decision-making process, which is coupled with the community's voice in the land use decision-making.
Thank you. I do want to encourage you, if you could submit those specific recommendations to the commission. We appreciate it.
Good evening, Councilwoman. So I think in a couple of the hearings, we've heard people talk about the issue of member deference. Now, we honestly know that we couldn't legislate away member deference. We couldn't include it in the charter or exclude it in the charter because it's the way the legislative body works. It's whether it's the New York City Council, the state legislature, or Congress. You know, having the respect of your colleagues and being able to support each other on these things makes the world turn. But what do we do? It's been said that if every council district created 5,000 units of housing, we could solve the housing crisis that New York City faces. But we know that not every district, for some council members, the creation of 500 units of housing is catastrophic to them, where others are doing 20,000 units. How do we break that so that we can find a way to actually achieve the stated goals of creating the amount of affordable housing that we need and protecting, the relationship that local elected officials have with the people who sent them to make those decisions for them? So you mentioned a few things in your testimony about making some potential changes to the certification process and to the approval process. Why not move that forward through the legislative process and not just wait for us to do something in the Charter Revision Commission and work together on that? Because you're right. When you mentioned the Metro North train station project, that discussion started 12 years ago. 12 years ago. It should not take 12 years to get to the point where you finally approved it as the representative from your district. So how do we break those log jams? It's not just the ULURP process, which shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. You shouldn't need a ULURP for a 5-story building and a 60-story building, right? We can probably agree on that. But what steps do you think could be taken at the legislative level that would help support whatever efforts we're doing here?
Well, I'd love to keep the conversation going on the legislative items, and I'm happy to take these specific recommendations to the legislative division to see what the council can draft up, and I'm happy to prime on those bills and work with you folks on it. The initial thought that came to mind on finding the spaces or the communities that can take on, whether it's 50, 500, or 5,000. We also have a bunch of housing stock that isn't necessarily housing stock, right? We have transitional housing, we have the stabilization housing, we have folks that are in shelters. I think some of that burden and the conversation that comes with whether or not ULURPs come up and where we place different housing spaces also deals with looking at which communities are taking the burden of some of these larger shelters or transitional housing hubs that are not getting housing opportunities for their local members too. So I mean, there's a whole host of things we could be working at as a city on how to stabilize New Yorkers and offer real housing opportunities for them. I think looking at DHS and the contracts we have and maybe even the properties that the city owns, our own assets, and what can be, transitioned or changed into housing. I know we're approved that and going through all of that notion as well. There's a lot of areas too that are not getting housing opportunities despite other areas that could even build a small shelter where those areas are not getting anything. And so I think we really need to talk about balancing of the scales and looking at what communities can take on what responsibility for all of New York, not just who can build the housing. It's all of it together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Majority Leader. And first, I just want to say you have personally been an amazing housing leader for the city. The speaker's been an amazing housing leader for the city, but it takes amazing housing leaders in the council to get housing built because of our current system. And I think one of the questions I have, acknowledging too that I think it's been something like 16 years since we've gotten a project through ULURP without the local members' support. You have been great at leveraging leveraging the ULURP process to get more resources, to make sure the project meets your community's needs. But there have been a lot of other members who have just used that leverage to ensure no projects are happening. And so I think the question I have, because we're not looking at this as a binary of should there be a ULURP or not. The question is, are there adjustments we can make to kind of correct for the fact that it does end up being a binary? Some people use ULURP to make projects better and fight for their community, and some use that power to truly block it. And so we have uneven development across the city. So I think my question is, would you support changes that at least try to correct for that imbalance, knowing that you still want to preserve kind of community input and a member's ability to change the project in the ways that are best for the project and for the community, but have some mechanism to kind of correct for the citywide imbalance we have? Because even the fair share framework, which I think the fair housing framework is amazing, but there's no teeth to it. We know that. We can analyze and say what would be fair for different districts to produce, but we have no mechanism for enforcing that. It just becomes a nice report and a kind of thought process. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how to kind of correct for that imbalance when the question isn't should we have ULURP or not. It's really how do you balance community input with this kind of citywide reality of what we've been dealing with member deference.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I think the operational side of it, I mean, Dan Savino brought up a great point, 12 years for Metro North to happen, and it ended up in my lap. And that entire process, the state's involvement for the first 5, 6, 7 years were more so telling people that it was coming, but not actually going into the community and talking about what's coming and how could they benefit, let alone the housing components that were attached to this application. None of that dialogue happened until I really asked DCP and this council's land use division to help re-engage the community in a real way. And I'm, super grateful for all the folks that worked with me on that. I mean, we had development teams that had their architects actually build models and show people plan A, plan B, plan C of what the development could look like to help realize for people and contextualize like the difference between 15 stories, 18 stories, 23 stories. And that supported my efforts in encouraging the community and really empowering them to own this project as their own again, and to feel good about building buildings that were for the community, that were going to create units for their families and their extended families or their kids and moms not to still be in their place with them. So I really think looking at DCP's process or the outreach part of this, creating more community engagement where it's in person, getting ideas. I mean, we had activities from people that were basically like forcing them to look at trade-offs. If you want a community center or you want a school, what does that mean in development of this housing? And does that mean we have to go taller or wider? Does that mean we get less 3 bedrooms and more 1 bedrooms? Things like that that helped people in the moment become more educated on the process and what opportunities were in front of them or what options they had, but also allowing them to help be decision makers. And I think that was the most empowering part of the process for people, that we re-engage them in the decision-making process. And for me, I think when looking at, and I fully understand, looking at every single project and having a fully engaged process can feel cumbersome and feel like our agencies don't have capacity to do that. But it was the reason why I had not a single protest and I had only cheers when we passed Metro North in my district, why I still have people excited for it to come. And I have people excited for taller buildings that come with the school and come with the community center and come with open space and come with commercial space at the bottom. That all happens because they were part of a super engaged process that actually contextualized the project for them. So I think if we can look at the steps it takes to come to a project in the community before even it goes to a community board vote, I think even beginning at how do we engage the land use committees and our community boards, or how do we engage the community board in that process? More times than not, I feel like it does, a piece of paper goes in front of people, or a PDF gets, swapped through on a meeting that is really supposed to be an hour, but ends up being 3 hours because of it. You're not as engaged in that process. Looking at the outreach and education component prior to that pre-certification phase, I think is really, really important in having communities buy in, or at least feel looped into the process of what's going to come in their community.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your testimony.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you. We're going to go, I think we're going to go slightly out of order. We're going to go to Zoom, where we have Council Member Selvina Brooks Powers.
Oh, she's on that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening. I am New York City Council Majority Whip Selvina Brooks Powers, proudly representing the 31st Council District in Southeast Queens. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Let me be clear, removing or limiting the City Council's role in the land use process would disenfranchise countless voices, particularly for working class communities of color that have too often been left out of decisions that shape our neighborhoods. Council members are the closest connection many New Yorkers have to city government, as my colleague had shared earlier, and we listen to our communities, not only when a development application comes up, but every day in between. We are intimately familiar with every block of our district. More importantly, we know the people that make up these blocks and these communities. That proximity allows us to broker real solutions that reflect both citywide needs and neighborhood priorities. A perfect example of that is the Ocean Crest rezoning in Far Rockaway. This proposal had stiff opposition at first from neighbors due to the density proposed. Working with my colleagues and community partners, we transformed what could have been a typical rental development into the first 100% affordable homeownership project in the Rockaways in more than a decade. 89, 89 families, many of them longtime residents, will now have an opportunity to own a home in a city that has made home ownership increasingly inaccessible, especially for Black New Yorkers. That's equity in action, that's generational wealth. And that kind of result simply would not have happened without local leadership guiding the ULURP process. Beyond this project, I've approved 4 other housing projects in my district for a total of over 2,300 units, 2,000 of which are affordable. For all of these projects, I was able to broker compromises that alleviated community concerns while also improving the proposals. It's been said that the ULURP process delays housing production, but the delays don't happen during the council's review. We have a short 50-day window to act. They happen long before certification and long after approval, during environmental review and when projects sit in line for HPD financing. Let's address those bottlenecks rather than dismantling one of the few avenues where communities still have a seat at the table. The council's involvement has made projects better, whether that's securing homeownership opportunities, supporting local hiring, or protecting open space. Our role should be strengthened, not sidelined. I do not agree with those that view the ULURP process and the negotiations as obstacles. The ULURP process is a cornerstone of our democracy, allowing everyday residents to have a role in shaping their community. I urge the Commission to focus on reforms that expand inclusion, build trust in the process, and accelerate housing in ways that don't sacrifice community input or equity. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you so much, council member. Are there any questions for the council member?
I got a question. So I wanted to know, in your testimony, whether you submitted, like, do you have ways, especially from this council standpoint, of being able to sort of like find suggestions to how to speed up that process? If definitely it's not a situation where the council is sort of like creating the delays, but are there ways to speed up that process? Just because I think the objective is really to find ways to get more housing done quicker in the city and in communities throughout the city, and not necessarily to eliminate community input, council input, et cetera.
Thank you for the question. Like I said before, many of my colleagues, including myself, feel that our 50-day review period is not nearly enough to have some of the comprehensive conversations that a ULURP process really requires when you're talking about transforming parts of your community. But in order to speed up the process when you're looking at it holistically, a part of it also is how do we move these projects through the HPD pipeline sooner? There are projects that I have approved in my first term. I'm now preparing to enter my 4th term 4 years later, and those projects have still not been put on the list to go to closing. And so we need to understand what that bottleneck is to be able to move these projects along, because oftentimes when the developers comes to us, they have an idea of where their financing is coming from and what they need. What this also does is it increases the cost of the development as well, because as we know, every day the price of construction goes up. And so sometimes it makes it that much less unattainable to see it through, because of now you have a gap that has been presented, and then the developer has to go and find other funding sources as a result.
Yeah.
You.
So sometimes I think that perhaps there may be capacity issues at HPD, and but I think probably and I want to know from you, do you think that it's also a question of the budget that they're working with, and perhaps we need to put significant funding behind HPD
And again, thank you for that. We have had this conversation with HPD trying to drill down to understand what the bottlenecks are that exist. I know that it's a mixed bag. There's an element of needing to staff up the agency because again, when I first got elected, it was, in the midst of the pandemic. So there was staffing challenges there, but then also having to prioritize all of the housing across the city. Everyone can't go at the same time. And so to your point, the funding is always going to be important. And this council has prioritized that, whether it be in the budget or different negotiations to try and support the work of HPD as well. But we can definitely work with the land use team to provide some additional recommendations if the commission is open to receiving that. But to your point, this is an area that really needs some focus and attention, which could help to move along a lot of these housing projects much sooner. Because right now, I can count at least 4 projects off the top of my head in my district that have been approved for several years since I've been a council member that have not been sent to closing yet.
Hi, council member. Thanks for your testimony. I think I want to ask a similar question that I just asked the majority leader, because I think part of the challenge, you're highlighting how you have used the ULURP process to negotiate for your community, and you've gotten to yes, and use that power to make sure that projects are meeting the needs of your local community. And the HPD, the affordable housing side of the world, where it's absolutely the case that we have a resource need to get through a lot of the backlog of projects. But I think part of what we've been focused on and hearing a lot about is not the challenge of with members who are willing to get to yes, but members who have used the kind of practice of member deference to not even let projects get started in the first place. And so what's happened is this unfair situation where most of the development has been happening in low-income communities, communities of color, and typically whiter, wealthier communities have been able to just block projects from starting off the ground from the start. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about just the fairness of that reality, and if you'd be in favor of some kind of mechanism that still gives you power and input to shape projects and get to yes in a way that works for you and your community, but really solves for this other problem that there are other colleagues that have been able to use the process to ensure nothing is happening, and not just HPD projects, but no development whatsoever, even of modest size.
So I can appreciate that that question. And what I will say is I don't look at it necessarily as members trying to not get to a yes. I think many members have often come in with good intentions, but they're not engaged early enough for sometimes the size of the projects. But I also think that this council takes seriously the need to create housing. And when we see that there is a greater citywide need or impact, the council takes that very seriously. But I do believe wholeheartedly that as a council member, we have a unique lens on our community and what our needs are and what some of the challenges are. So there may be a type of development that's being proposed in our district that may work in one part of New York City and not necessarily in another. Give my district, for example, where we have crumbling infrastructure, where we are largely a coastal community and already have great density. So when myself or members that have districts that are very similar, it may come off like we are NIMBY or that we don't want to see development when that's not the case. It's about being nuanced, understanding that we have vulnerable communities. Certain districts lack the basic infrastructure, and members may need to address those challenges before they can accommodate additional density. So I think while we look to address the housing crisis, we can't do it in a vacuum in the sense that we're not taking into account other elements in that community on the ground, because what then happen will be that will then make a community even more vulnerable. So like as you see, NASA put out a report about a year or so ago talking about New York City sinking. When you look at some of those community districts that are included, a lot of it is in my district, right? So when I approach ULURP, I have to take that into account and not solely just building housing. And so in the council, again, I think we have that unique lens that the agencies may not have. They have the lens of the housing crisis globally and a goal of creating X amount of housing. We have a responsibility to our community to make sure that we do create housing, because every district has a housing crisis and is impacted by that. But we also have to be nuanced in how we approach it.
Thank you so much, council member. Thank you so much for your testimony. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to call council member Alexa Aviles.
Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. How are we doing?
Great, council member.
Great. Thank you so much. I've lived in Sunset Park for over 20 years. I'm a Brooklynite, actually raised in East New York, Brooklyn. So I have seen many, many changes.
Give me if I could say 1 second.
Yes,
Shout out to
sir.
East New York.
That's especially for you. I have seen many, many changes in our incredible borough of Brooklyn. And among them has been certainly over the recent history of commiserating with so many fellow neighbors about how our neighborhoods were growing more and more unaffordable, watching families being dispersed, having to move out of state, losing the cohesion of knowing everyone on the block. Which really meant a lot for communities. That's how we survived very difficult conditions. And yet here we are still with new raising costs, and we continue to watch neighborhoods like Sunset Park and Red Hook and working class Black and brown neighbors get pushed aside again and again through our city's political process. Of course, anger is rising when we see the interests of wealthy, well-resourced communities being protected, while other communities are completely being disregarded. And so in every way, these neighborhoods are our homes, and we want to take care and nurture it. And that's why when I was elected first as a public servant to fight alongside my neighbors to see our neighborhoods that were overlooked, to know intimately that the struggles we face as a home of immigrant and working class New Yorkers. And this is among one of the many reasons why City Council their agency should be protected in this land use process, and in some ways expanded. And I can get into that a little more later. Our housing issues through long-term sustainable solutions to affordability is where we really need to get. When we talk about the ULURP process and zoning changes, we're talking about changing people's homes, our lives, our histories, and we're trying to build a better future. And so City Council has a say in that process because we're able to speak to, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, the really deeply rooted concerns and idiosyncrasies of all of our neighborhoods in very, very intimate ways. And frankly, when the administration, any mayoral administration has a variety of interests, it too is a political body that is driven by politics in the same way that individuals, and certainly these tools that we have at our disposal, while very imperfect and ways to improve them, do have an important protection mechanism among them. And so rather than taking a sledgehammer to this instrument, I think it's important to be surgical here because there is a lot of nuance, and I'll I just completely disregarded my comments. Lastly, I'll just say, the city council's participation here is an intimate and a short one. And there are certainly significant problems with the overall process. As you've heard my colleagues mention, years and years of delays for projects, which are outside of our scope. But if we are trying to solve a problem, among some of those solutions would certainly be a more strategic intervention and looking very closely at all of it. And in particular, putting in guardrails to protect both from the political winds of a mayoral administration who may not be considering the nuances of a neighborhood, and members who may not be interested in bringing more housing when we have a crisis in our city. So not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but really looking at this finely with a fine-tooth comb and allowing the members to continue to represent their communities in a 50-day period. That is what we have as community representatives, which is really important. And we should think about strengthening those tools rather than diminishing them, because removing council authority and process from this larger process would truly be a detriment to our communities and our interests. And by and large, you see council members negotiating significant community benefits that would have never been there had it not been for their participation and their commitment to protecting the interests of their community members. I'll stop there.
Any questions?
Thank you, Council Member. I was struck by what you said at the outset, which is how, and I can appreciate how you and other communities and council members feel about your communities getting a lot of housing while, as you said, other communities are protected. We heard a lot of testimony from developers saying that one of the first things they do is look and see which council members are at all receptive to housing and which ones aren't. And those that aren't, they just won't proceed at all. They won't go forward. They won't propose projects because they'd have to invest a lot of money and it would be, at the end of the day, a waste of time. And in fact, the communities that you referenced that are protected have been protected for a long time by council member after council member resisting housing in those districts. How would you address that issue, given the existing willingness of council members to defer to each individual council member as to the desires of his or her district?
Well, thank you for the question. I would first make an amendment here. This is not a process that solely depends on a council member and a developer. There is an administration, there is with DCP, there is the whole process, there is the borough president. There are actually many political bodies that determine kind of the life cycle of these projects.
I don't want to interrupt you, but in fact, it does depend on, usually, on a developer who's prepared to put up some money up front
Sure.
in order to potentially see a project completed at the end of the day. And if that developer or any developer is unprepared to do that, irrespective of what the city can do, there's really not going to be development in that district.
Well, I think again here, there are many voices that determine kind of whether a project comes to fruition or not. If developers are not interested in engaging in the work that it will require to responsibly develop in our city, then I think that that's their choice. I think lacking a comprehensive plan for our city, which I think is a really fundamental problem for our city, that we do not comprehensively plan, where we can make sure that we are not only building to achieve certain level of goals to make sure that our city runs appropriately and has fair distribution of whatever, public mechanisms that it requires, right, to run effectively. I think you have to, it is not just the developers' whims here. You have, it's carrots and sticks and guardrails and responsible development. So I don't think it's just a developer. If we want to incentivize the appropriate development as a city, our administration should be doing that. Our council members should be doing that, and we should be doing it in a way where there's appropriate guardrails and appropriate considerations, because there are different nuances. In fact, our community had we haven't had a ton of development, but we have had an enormous amount of siting of shelters. We've had a building of all these hotels in a community where there was no tourist attraction. They were being built because the city was incentivizing shelter as a good business model. And so there was no one watching for interests there, right? So, but the development was moving towards the money. So I think, there's no easy answer here, and I can't solve the problem of the developers who are chasing their profit, but I can say on behalf of the public interest of this city that we not only need to comprehensively plan, but we have to place guardrails on all facets here, right? Because if you are chasing the dollar, you're certainly not chasing the public interest. Maybe those two can converge, and many times they do, and it's a good thing. Nevertheless, what we see is development that is not quite hitting the interests and the need within our city. And this is where the council's intervention is able to help move that in the place closer to the needs of the residents. I'm not sure I fully answered your question.
There may not be a fully answerable answer.
I'm just going to follow up on that. So first of all, thank you for coming tonight, Councilwoman. Assuming we had a comprehensive plan, I'm not sure exactly how we would define that, because state zoning law requires us to have a comprehensive plan for zoning purposes. But let's assume we created a plan that said we have 51 council districts in the city of New York. I don't know how many neighborhoods there are. I'm sure Gail Brewer knows the answer to that question. But that plan that New York City would create alongside the council and city planning is to have X number of new housing units across all 5 boroughs, all 51 council districts, every community to meet the need. We still come up against the fact that there are certain districts and certain council members, and I know a few of them who live pretty close to me, who are vehemently opposed to any development. So how do we square that circle? How do we solve that problem? So even if we had this comprehensive plan which identified how we build and where we build and how many stories, we still have, because of the local, representation. And I agree, the council member is the closest person to the community. I absolutely agree with you on that. Voters sent you there to make decisions, but we do run up against this. There are people for whom the idea of building any units of housing in their district, they are vehemently opposed to.
Yeah. I mean, we run up against it almost in every facet. We run up against it with polluting facilities, of which my community has a disproportionate amount. We run up against it with shelters, of which my community has a disproportionate amount. So this is not a unique problem to the housing space. It is certainly a unique problem to a very diverse city that has a lot of competing needs and often protects powerful interests.
Yes.
So I think there are many interventions here. I don't think one intervention will solve this problem. I think we as a city need to, we have a fair share housing policy. There is a fair share shelter siting policy. No one follows it. There's no enforcement. And what does the agency do? It says, we believe in this fair share policy. However, here's your number 18 shelter facility, while your 2 neighbors have 0 shelter facilities. How do we solve that problem? We need an administration who's committed to proper siting. We need to have some enforcement mechanisms there. We probably need to change the siting process to say, no, actually, you cannot build over a certain threshold in a community.
Mhm.
So I think there are many mechanisms here. I think what we want to be, while there are a few members who maybe stop the development of housing in their districts, I don't think the answer is removing the power of the council members still to be able to advance projects in their communities
Mhm.
that bring benefit. It feels too blunt of a response. I think we're trying to tackle what is thankfully not a giant problem. It is a problem without question, but I think we've seen more benefit. We have to tackle it, I think, in a number of different ways.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next, we hear from Councilmember Gail Brewer.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much.
Like that. Mhm.
Thank you.
Oh, shit, no. According to the New York Times, there are 350 neighborhoods in New York City, and according
knew
to
you would
the
get me the answer.
Department of City Planning, there are 339. So take your choice. So I'm Gail Brewer. I'm City Council member for District 6, Upper West Side, the 50s to the 90s, and Central Park, and I chair Council Committee on Oversight and Investigation. So I'm not gonna, just in time, I list the fact that Tish James, when she was in the council, and I had we passed a law, I think Weisbrot knows about it, that passed, we had a commission that was, I think, more representative than this one or anybody else's. And then we go through the time that de Blasio, as soon as the council had a commission, he had a commission. And now the same thing is happening. Just to give a little history of the charter issues. Number two, I'm going to just list some of the concerns I have. ULURP is just really small on my list, but I can talk more if you want. I've done 250 ULURPs in my life. In terms of land use, I just want to talk about the Franchise and Concession Review Committee. FCRC, as you know, those outcomes are weighted in the mayor's favor. The charter also states that when an application relates to more than one borough, the borough president share a single vote. I did pitch in the past that FCRC in 2010, along with Christine Quinn, that we should have a different system. The reforms were not considered, and the Adams administration is poised to award the expiring contract for operation, for instance, on the Woolman Rink in Central Park, perhaps to the Trump Organization or another private outfit. The reason I mention this would be an example where I think the city council, when it's a major concession, and I list this in my testimony, should be the ones considering that kind of a decision. I feel very strongly about it, and that is something that I'd like to have considered as part of your deliberations. In terms of ULURP, I agree a lot with my colleagues. I do want to say that one aspect that has been in the way it's been done, but not mandated. And I do think, to answer your question, Carl, how you could speed up the process. Mandate that the Department of City Planning brief community boards on any ULURP application before the process begins. A lot of these community boards are turning over with that stupid 8-year thing that you came up with in the previous charters. So they only have 8 years. And that means they never really learn land use. And so therefore, they need briefing. And then they need to have much more support in terms of the fund for the city of New York, having the wonderfully Alvin Bonilla trained urban fellows to help them with their process. That is how you're going to speed it up. Some of the neighborhoods, how do you end up having ULURP that is helpful to developing housing? You have to listen and maybe not make them, 30 stories tall. Quickly, I want to establish a New York City land bank. It could be done legislatively, but it can also be done by the charter. I want to protect landmark buildings. As you know, we have one now that the developer wants to tore down. It is landmarked, and I think individually designated landmarks, if they are to be torn down, the decision should be made by the same organization that landmarked them, called the City Council. I want to say we had a discussion today about the issue of how you deal with outdoor cafes on the roadside and battery swapping cabinets. One of the ways that these get delayed is they need a revocable consent. Get rid of it and do a permit. Makes much more sense. Budget independence for oversight agencies, you'll see my list. These agencies, some of them have the ability to be tagged and to the agency that they deal with. IBO is an example with OMB, but guess what? Department of Investigation does not have that. Board of Correction does not have that. Special Commission for Investigation of the School District does not have that. Really tiny budgets compared to what they have to do. They need to be tied to an agency. Enhanced units of appropriation. Oh my goodness. You'll have police department has in one unit of appropriation borough-wide offices, detective division, forensic investigation, narcotics division, and the SRG, Strategic Response Group. Operations, how the hell are you supposed to know what's in that? Revenue estimates, the city council and the mayor's office should somehow come to some kind of an agreement. I believe in advice and consent. We did it as a result of my commission, and it should be for all the other agencies. I know that wasn't loved by the mayor's office. I feel strongly about it. And then if a local law is passed, it should be implemented. Mayoral control of some of the commissions should be less mayoral control. And I talked about the DOI. And then I do believe, as the Citizens Union does, that we should have election cycles that are all one, so that people would actually not have to vote so many times during the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councilmember.
You're welcome, sir.
Any questions?
I have a question. First of all, thank you. You know, I knew you would know the answer to any and all questions. On one of the recommendations you have about the community boards, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. 8 years is not enough time to learn. It's not enough time to learn how land use in a community board level, or 8 years is not enough time to learn how to become a council member.
Correct.
But that being said, community boards are oftentimes more opposed to development than anybody. So how do we resolve that? So again, I actually know some council members and other elected officials who say they would never, ever take a position in opposition to what their community board recommended, even though it's a non-binding vote. So if we were to go through this to reform this process and inform the community board, and they said no, how does that council member then move forward?
Well, the council member needs to have a little guts, first of all.
Well,
But the
guts is in
second-
short supply these days.
No,
Gail.
I understand that. I have a lot of guts. So, but the issue is the lack of understanding of land use at the community board level is intense. I was borough president. I had to appoint people. We did trainings constantly, and it still is enough. So I would say also, if you are in an area, I don't know anything besides Manhattan. I know there are 5 boroughs, but I never go to the other ones. And so I am not familiar with, suburban Queens or suburban Staten Island. I know they're beautiful, but I don't go there.
We're going to bring you
So,
out there.
I know, but you pointed out in your area in Staten Island
yeah.
that people are opposed. So the issue for me would be like what Community Board 4 did in Manhattan. They went to every single lot in that community, and they have actually superb land use experts on the board, and they have a report. You should read it, and it lists every single way that affordable housing could be built on every single lot, the way they want to do it, and they're building it. So that, you have, if somebody doesn't want, a 30-story building in an area that has, 10-story buildings, I don't even know what a 10-story building looks like in Manhattan, then go with a low-rise, affordable, maybe home ownership. That's what, instead of spending years fighting this stuff, for God's sake, go with something that is acceptable and compromise in that area. That's what I would do.
Thank
You know what? I would make it happen.
All right. I
Yeah,
know you
Carl
would.
Weisbrod. How many is this for you?
Excuse me? I hesitate to ask you a question, but I
How
will.
many?
But I will.
How many commissions is this for you? That's what I want to know.
Only 2.
Only 2?
Only 2.
I don't believe it.
No. Actually, I do have a question for you, Councilmember, which is, you've been both a borough president and a council member. And do you think that the balance of the roles of the borough president and the council member with respect to ULURP and the land use process is about right? Or do you think it should be modified in some way?
It's a good question. The way, on the controversial projects, it's easy on the ones that are not. But on the controversial projects, the community goes to the community board, and then the borough president, which has a land use staff, right, that helps. Between the two of them, if it's a controversial project, they make changes, the council makes change, I mean, the borough president makes changes, the community board makes changes. So by the time it gets to the city council, hopefully, there's enough cover, because when it's really controversial, it's rough to have to say yes to a very tall building or in an area that people don't want housing, or they don't like poor people, or whatever the hell it is. Then, so I do think that the city council member gets some cover from the borough president, to answer your question. Because the borough president doesn't have to vote. They just have to recommend. Now the borough president, when you're there, you feel kind of powerless. Like, why the hell does the city council get to vote on this? But if it's controversial, you might be pleased. It's a political process. But I do think the relationship, if the borough president has a good land use staff, and the city council has one too, but it's not just focused on that council member. So the borough president, you lean heavily on what they have to say, and they lean on the community board. Along the way, to be honest with you, no matter how good staff is, there's not a lot of it. And it's, probably could all use some more intelligent thinking about what really is needed. That's, we're really lacking in thoughtful consideration of what really could be built. I'm struggling right now. I'm trying to figure out ABC, Extel, Gary Barnett. That's a big, challenging situation, and we're trying on every level to think outside the box. It's hard. There aren't a lot of people who really know land use in the city of New York, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you.
Now you know how many neighbors there are in New York.
Somewhere between 339 and 350. Next, we'll have a panel. I'm going to invite up Jessica Katz and Howard Slatkin. I'll ask the commissioners to hold their questions until both have testified. Jessica, you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, and thank you for inviting me to testify here today. My name is Jessica Katz. I'm a lifelong houser and a former government official. Thank you for your service to this commission. After more than 20 years in the housing industry, both inside and outside government, I strongly believe it's time to change the rules of the road for how housing gets built. You might not hear this a lot during this process, but I'm actually a huge fan of ULURP. For more than a decade, it was my job, my honor and privilege really, to go before community boards and make the pitch for supportive housing projects for chronically homeless New Yorkers. I've stood in school auditoriums and senior center cafeterias in every borough, a couple times pregnant and in heels, answering questions and hearing community concerns, sorting out fact from fiction. I've been called every name in the book. I've been shouted at in every neighborhood in the city. And I truly appreciated those moments where things got heated in those meetings because it gave me the opportunity to set the record straight about the challenges faced by New Yorkers experiencing homelessness, to build some empathy and understanding in the hopes that when the building opened, the community would welcome their new neighbors. For every project that had a small but vocal army of opponents, it was my job to help build a base of support. And I knew that if the opponents would just meet some supportive housing tenants, they would see that their fears were unfounded. But I always had my misgivings about this strategy. It was effective, but it was a lot to ask of formerly homeless New Yorkers who had just achieved a measure of stability. I'd be asking them to appear publicly before an angry crowd to tell their traumatic stories and how they overcame the worst times in their lives in an effort to win a little grace for the next homeless New Yorker who desperately needed a place to live. In those moments, it felt like the rules of the game were rigged in favor of stably housed New Yorkers. Housing is a human right is a really lovely phrase, but how do you make it more than a bumper sticker? First of all, you need to build some housing for housing to be a human right. And also legally, a human right is something that's even more important than democracy. We elevate certain rights and we put them on a higher plane because those rights are so fundamental that they're not subject to the whims of public opinion. So housing as a human right means we shouldn't be asking for a show of hands to determine whether our homeless neighbors live stable lives or die in the street. Another change that has had a huge impact on housing development has been term limits. When the current Euler process was designed, we were typically working with local elected officials who'd been in office a long time and who would continue to hold their seats long after the controversy about any particular project had died down. So the players in the project would be around to see a project go from idea to implementation, from an angry community board meeting to a round of applause at a ribbon cutting. Today, term limits means that council members who are skeptical of new housing have little reason to take into account their future constituents who may need housing. And even the most pro-housing council members will likely not be in office to see a project come to fruition. This combination of short-term limits and long development timelines is a structural problem that inhibits new housing that was not the case when our current land use rules were first created. So I'm so grateful to this commission for finding new ways to build more housing. This is necessary because the affordability crisis is worse than ever before, because it's not fair to ask our homeless neighbors to fight for their lives in a Euler process that is stacked against them, and because term limits has fundamentally changed the rules of the road. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Bury and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Howard Slacken, Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council. And I would like to use the opportunity this evening to build on testimony that I presented to this commission back in February and highlight some of the specifics of the proposals we published in our report, Key Charter Reforms for Housing and Land Use. I'll also describe one additional proposal not included in that report that I think is responsive to the issues that the commission is considering here. In highlighting these elements of this proposal, of these proposals, I want to emphasize, as part of tonight's discussion, that I don't think the question is whether the city council should have a role in the process of land use review, but what the effect of and how to incorporate the city council's review within the land use process. The proposal that we've outlined in this report wouldn't remove the council from Euler, but would lean into the council's role as a citywide body that also, like other participants in the process, is responsible for integrating local and citywide concerns and not acting in a strictly local capacity. A key element of these proposals would be to create a check, a procedural check on member deference that would, in the event that it would compromise the broader public interest by allowing, by supermajority vote at the City Planning Commission, an override or modification of a council vote on a land use action. In addition, the proposals include giving the council speaker the 13th appointment to the City Planning Commission in order to provide opportunities for coordinated and cooperative review rather than the sequential and rivalrous review that occurs through the process in most circumstances today. And finally, to make council's review of land use actions optional rather than mandatory, which could, in the event that there is an outcome that could be achieved at the commission with that composition of the commission, would take nearly 2 months off of the process. I'll also highlight one additional item, proposal, which would be in order to address the issue of the challenges facing affordable housing development, particularly in geographies where there has been an insufficient supply of affordable housing, providing the Board of Standards and Appeals with the ability to provide project-specific zoning relief for affordable housing developments in areas where there's been an insufficient supply of housing. The BSA would have the authority to waive zoning provisions based on findings of programmatic necessity and neighborhood character. And the emphasis here is that this is project-specific relief for a proposal. It's not a zoning change. The underlying zoning would not change through that process. I can answer any questions about those proposals.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Any questions for this panel? Carl and then-
Mr. Slacken, the proposal to allow the BSA to, for certain kinds of projects to, in effect, modify the zoning for that project. How would that be after the EULA process? Would that be instead of the EULA process? How would that work?
Right, the idea is it would be instead of the Euler process and strictly for a category of affordable housing projects, essentially projects that are going to be subject to a regulatory agreement owned by an HDFC and can be targeted toward geographies where there has been an insufficient number of affordable housing units provided in order to counterbalance that.
Thank you.
That's the trigger, then you allow that?
Sure. The threshold, and this is building on things like the fair housing framework that the city council has laid out. The idea is that there are clearly geographies that fall below a threshold. What that threshold can be set, but there are clearly geographies that fall below that threshold in which there has been insufficient production of affordable housing, and this sort of streamlined process would be available in those places.
I have a question. Thank you. I have a question for Jessica. First of all, it's good to see you. And so earlier in the testimony, we heard from the Majority Leader, Amanda Farias, Alexei Vilas and Gail Brewer, about some of the challenges of the long process. So it's based on your experience in the past, like what could we do to improve the process before it ever gets to the ULURP? Because the council members said they only have 50 days to approve a project, but some of these projects go on for years. I mean, I still reflect on Coney Island. We rezoned Coney Island in 2009. And some of those buildings are fine. They're just getting to the ribbon cutting now. That is 16 years later. I lost track, 16 years later. So what can we do in the pre-certification process, the HPD process? How do we, expand the ability to finance some of them or to come to closing sooner? How do we do that? And you must have some thoughts based on your long-term experience working in this field.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are resources, staffing, and procedural improvements like the Get Stuff Done report are all very important to achieve in order to push forward the pipeline that already exists. The pre-certification period, I think, is really just a reflection of the way that member deference works in the actual ULURP process that makes ULURP, in a way, sort of perfunctory, where you can negotiate with someone for years or even decades, and you would never enter into a formal ULURP without having some confidence of the actual outcome. So I think those two things are related. So if you felt like you had a broader constituency to appeal to, then you wouldn't have this very long tail before the ULURP process started.
I don't think enough has been said also about the requirements that the state places on local governments with respect to development. So yes, I think today is the 1-year anniversary of Albany last year finally giving New York City the tools it needs to, get the old 421A projects in the pipeline and create a replacement 485X. I don't know when, or how long it's going to take for anybody to actually utilize any of those new tools. But the reality is the state does require the city, not just New York City, but all localities to adhere to a certain set of principles, particularly around environmental review. And some of those things take an extraordinary amount of time. Now, certainly we don't want to build housing on brownfields, and we want to make sure that we're building appropriately and safe housing. But is there some way for us, independent of what we do with the Charter Revision Commission, to change that dynamic so that the state takes its foot off the neck of, say, local government?
Sure. And I think the seeker process in particular is designed to measure the impact of doing a thing and assumes that the impact of doing nothing is nothing. And with housing, that's just not the case. The impact of building no housing is very significant, but we don't measure that if we're not doing it in the first place. So that's something that the seeker process doesn't embody that well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a question?
So I have one for you, Howard. But Jessica, I think you might have said something, but I was going to ask, is there something that the charter can do to help address the housing crisis? And I think you were speaking to that just now.
Yeah, I mean, I think homelessness in particular, that's the kind of narrow lens that I've taken here. It's just not a hyper-local issue. And we have many, many ways in the existing land use process to address those hyperlocal issues and not a lot of other ways to address a citywide immediate crisis. So, when Hurricane Sandy hit, we sheltered tens of thousands of people who are homeless like it was our number one priority and it was our job. Meanwhile, we've been living with tens of thousands of homeless people and not really treated it like it was much of an emergency prior to that. If you're strictly looking at a human rights perspective, you would never do a show of hands and a public opinion poll about whether or not we should have a roof over people's heads. Failing that kind of radical change, there's plenty of ways that have been suggested by some of the experts on these panels and by this body in terms of looking at a broader citywide approach that is not necessarily treating every single project individually and kind of treating the housing crisis with the urgency that it's going to require.
And for Howard, thank you. And for Howard, so when I'm listening to your statement, and I heard you mention this in the previous testimony, you were talking, it sounded like towards the issue of member deference, and you was associated with where there is a need and with the planning and I guess fair share. So I wanted to like kind of like find out from you if what you were speaking to, because it sounds to me a little like eminent domain. Is it that, or is it something else?
I'm sorry, which part of it sounds like
You
that?
you were saying that the supermajority, yeah.
Yes, okay. Yeah, and it has, I think, I hope it doesn't, and it's not intended to. So let me see if I can clarify that. It is just a matter of providing a procedural rebalancing of the way that decisions are arrived at through the process that we already have for ULURP. The same types of land use decisions would be made through that process, but in the event, one of the things that we highlighted in our report, The Elephant in the Room, is that land use and zoning is the only arena in which the city council effectively votes on things that are strictly local in nature. Everything else, local laws are general in nature. They affect the city. The policies may affect different parts of the city in different ways. And of course, there's a lot of texture to that. But there's no such thing as member deference in the other arenas of the council's authority. The issue here is to try to create a process by which the other actors in the ULURP process, the other officials at the borough-wide or the city-wide level, have an opportunity to articulate, actually, there's a broader interest at stake here, and this decision needs to be considered in that light. It's, as other speakers have said tonight, there's not a way to say, thou shalt not have member deference. It's inherent in the nature of a deliberative body where, members elected from a district allow each member to look after the issues that are specific to their district. The idea is to introduce a level on which that then gets reintroduced to the citywide or borough-wide level. The original ULURP process in 1975, the idea was give voice to community concerns as the first step of the process. Begin the process with hearing what the local community has to say. Then you gradually proceed to higher levels of geography. And at the citywide level, then it was the aptly derided Board of Estimate. But the idea was that the decision happened at some broader level where all those perspectives could be integrated. The effect of member deference in the 1989 charter revisions was to short circuit that and basically take the city council, which is a citywide body, and turn it into effectively a local body on local actions, which returns you to the first part of the process. And that was, I would say, a bug and not a feature. It does not mean that the council and that local perspectives are not important to bring into the process of the council. It just means that the last vote in the process shouldn't be local in nature.
One last question.
Yes. Thank you both for your testimony, first of all. I have a question for Ms. Katz. Given your specific experience, I want to get your thoughts about something and want to connect kind of 2 points that have been made. So I think you've heard the suggestion that there could be tweaks to ULURP or carve-outs for certain things. And you talked about this idea of elevating certain rights. And some of that speaks to, in my mind, at least, the idea that there could be a consensus, that there could be certain things such as all affordable proposals that have a level of significance or are critical enough that we could all agree that they could be in this carve out. At the same time, we've heard testimony that says that, well, there are bottlenecks in the system that have to do with the scarcity of funding or bonding capacity and the like. So I want to hear from you. Do the idea of carve-outs in light of the other constraints exacerbate the problem? Or could you, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think we have to work on both tracks. I think in housing, we're not going to find that one single solution that's going to solve the problem. I do think in terms of some of the negotiations that go around on ULURP, I think the way that that functions right now actually exacerbates some of the equity concerns across the city, right? Like a well-heeled neighborhood does not need to beg for parks funding or education funding or a daycare center in exchange for blocking a ULURP. They just block the ULURP. Whereas it's those neighborhoods that do need to kind of beg for those resources because they lack them that engage in that kind of negotiation, whereas the ones that already have the resources just say no in the first place. So I do think that the equity issues are exacerbated by the fact that we have this member deference and so much inequality across the city. And I think that a more citywide or a borough-wide approach would actually improve some of those equity issues.
Thank you so much both for your testimony.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I do have, we heard from Councilmember Aviles and I think others about fair share and I think what we would all recognize is that fair share as envisioned by the 1989 charter has not lived up to its expectations, to put it mildly. Do either of you have suggestions on how fair share can be improved and to what extent it can be applicable not only to the kinds of uses that neighborhoods don't want to see, but the kinds of uses that we would want to see, including more housing? And I'm not necessarily asking for you to respond now, but if you can think about it and let us know.
Yeah, I will do that, but I would just add that as some of the other speakers have alluded to, there's not a simple objective way to construe what fair share means. You know, what is the ability of a neighborhood to support one thing or the other, and with certain types of facilities, I don't think that it's even easy to say whether a facility is desirable or not in an objective sense. I think that there's a lot of texture to that. So I think for that reason, I think it's important, and I will consider the question in more detail as well, but I think it's important to look at the political decision-making process and the procedures for decision-making in which all of those issues are going to be considered and balanced, rather than to look for formulas that are going to substitute for the judgment of the people acting in that process.
Yeah, I would add that fair share, as it's currently written, is primarily a reporting process and a disclosure process rather than a kind of decision-making yes or no tool. I think it should probably remain that way, particularly if when viewed through the lens of, say, a supportive housing or a social services kind of service where you're dealing primarily with people who are disabled, who have a mental health issue, who have a substance abuse issue, and these are all protected classes, and you really can't, or we shouldn't and we can't create a system that says, no, there are too many of those kind of people here, the same way we would not do that for other kind of protected classes.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Our next panel will be Brittany McKenzie and Carrie Butler. While you are coming, I'll just notify the next panel so you're ready. They'll be followed by Sarah Pennenberg and Annie Levers. Whoever would like to start first.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thank you, commissioners, for the opportunity to submit our testimony and contribute to this important discussion. The Fair Housing Justice Center, FHJC, is a nonprofit civil rights organization committed to eliminating housing discrimination, promoting inclusive and accessible communities, strengthening the enforcement of fair housing laws throughout New York City and its 7 surrounding counties. For over 2 decades, FHJC has played a leading role in advancing housing equity and access across our region. We have assisted thousands of individuals and organizations in challenging discriminatory practices, filing complaints, and asserting their legal rights under local, state, and federal fair housing laws. Our organization operates a full-service fair housing program, including proactive investigation, systemic testing, litigation support, policy advocacy, education, and technical assistance. Through our investigative work, FHJC has uncovered widespread discriminatory practices among both housing providers and public agencies. Our legal actions, more than 160 in total, have resulted in increased compliance, open access to over 80,000 units, and secured $55 million in damages and penalties. Yet, despite these victories, discrimination remains a persistent force shaping housing opportunity and access in New York City. We submit this testimony today to urge the Charter Commission to take bold, necessary steps to embed a stronger fair housing mandate within the city's planning governance and accountability structures. As a member of the Thriving Communities Coalition, the FHJC supports the Our Neighborhood, Our Plans initiative, which calls for a fair and comprehensive planning approach. While we support the range of recommendations of the Thriving Communities Coalition, given our service area and expertise, we want to highlight and provide recommendations related to fair housing and fair housing enforcement. Specifically, 1, strengthening the Fair Housing Plan in the Charter pursuant to the Thriving Communities Coalition Comprehensive Plan. The Thriving Communities Coalition Comprehensive Plan is attached in my written testimony, which you'll see. Secondly, require fair housing planning documents, including those required by the city charter, to evaluate how city laws, zoning codes, infrastructure investment, and program administration affects residential segregation, the relative success of fair housing enforcement efforts, and the location, availability, and accessibility of housing. For example, CHR should be required to release data on discrimination complaints received and to make preliminary determinations on whether discrimination exists, regardless of whether it proceeds with enforcement. Third, any update to the city charter as it relates to residential units must enforce stricter requirements and robust oversight around the design and construction. May I have more time?
Just a few seconds.
Yeah, just one more point. I'll start from the top. Any update to the city charter as it relates to residential units must enforce stricter requirements and robust oversight around the design and construction standards to ensure that all new developments and renovations are fully accessible to people with disabilities. My last point, expand on access to home ownership opportunities and implement reforms that ensure fairness and inclusivity in housing markets. The commission's recommendations should include advocating with the mayor and the city council to pass the Co-op Disclosure Bill 407, currently pending before the city council. Just to conclude, addressing these structural issues requires more than acknowledgement. It requires sustained, coordinated action and the political will to make bold and often uncomfortable changes. New York City has often been described as a tale of two cities. One where privilege is preserved through restrictive zoning and planning policies, and another where communities of color and low-income residents are left to shoulder the burden of limited affordable housing options and government disinvestment. If we're serious about equity, we must stop mistaking performative planning for progress. And the time to review is now. The time for action is now. Thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Carrie Butler. I am the interim president of the Municipal Art Society, and MAS does support the Thriving Communities Coalition's draft text for comprehensive planning. We are a member of that coalition, but today I'm going to focus on ULURP, the funnest wonky topic. So it's also a notoriously expensive and risky process, especially for smaller and nonprofit developers. And it can be opaque and confusing for community members. I think there were a lot of important topics that were touched on today, including community members having a lack of resources and knowledge about land use process, how complicated it can be. MAS does try to do some of that work with our Livable Neighborhoods program, But it is complicated, and I also have heard, and I'm going a little off script here, sorry, but I also have heard from many people that it is the time before ULURP that can be most risky because it's so unknown and it has a lot to do with personal, I guess, opinions and things, in the process. And I think there's also an importance to note that there's city planning's process when they want to rezone and do a neighborhood plan, where they have been, I think, doing a really good job of going into the community for an extended period of time, but then you have private developers. So there's different types of processes here. So there have been a lot of proposals shared, and I'm just going to go through some of the things that MAS supports as quickly as I can. We support increasing efficiency and improving transparency and reducing the timeline if possible. Perhaps that would be establishing, as I said, about the process, establishing a formalized pre-certification phase to reduce uncertainty, having perhaps community boards and borough presidents conduct concurrent reviews. You perhaps could change the order of reviews, so shifting city council to before the borough president or having them happen concurrently. Establishing an appeals panel. Perhaps it would be members of different representatives, city planning, community board, borough president, and the council. Evaluating the scope of actions that require ULURP. There are 12 categories, some of which are often bypassed because of due to city planning's rulemaking authority. I think we should establish a transparent process for regular city planning evaluation of these actions subject to ULURP to both remove those that are outdated, but also perhaps incorporating new categories as environments change. Allowing CPC final decision-making authority on a selection of smaller scale or CPC-determined low-impact projects. Okay, can I just real quickly say which we don't? We are strongly opposed to incentivizing the disposition of city-owned property to expedite short-term development. This will compromise the city's long-term flexibility and control and weaken the ability to leverage those assets to achieve broader housing and climate goals in our future. We oppose fast tracking for specific uses because it could lead to inadequate community input, incomplete impact assessments, and diminishing project quality. And we do not propose adding time limits to application or pre-certification processes, as those have shown poor results in other cities. And we strongly oppose consolidating ULURP decision-making within within the mayor or city council.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Any questions for the panel?
Thank you both for your testimony. And given your work at the Fair Housing Justice Center, I think there was other testimony talking about the extent to which the scarcity of housing drives the discriminatory practices. I'd be interested to hear if you found that, concur with that statement.
So housing discrimination is very prevalent and is happening regardless of whether communities have a lot of housing or a little bit of housing. And that's what we see in our investigative efforts. So I would say it's not restricted to just communities that don't have enough units, but it's really happening throughout the city.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, I'll invite Sarah Pennenberg and Annie Levers. Just so that they're prepared, they'll be followed by DeRay McKesson and Cassandra Ipaso.
Hi, good evening, you guys. My name is Sarah Pennenberg, and I'm here on behalf of SEIU Local 32BJ. 32BJ is the largest union of property service workers in the country, representing over 175,000 members across 13 states, including tens of thousands of commercial property service workers, security guards, airport workers, and residential building staff in New York. 32BJ believes that the city's ULURP process is a vital democratic process through which community members, groups, including labor unions, have the opportunity to engage developers, the projects that shape New York City. Through decades of involvement in city land use review process, our union has been able to defend hard-won industry standard, wages, benefits, and to educate the real estate industry and legislators about the importance of creating good jobs in the property service sector. At the same time, our union understands the urgency of New York City's housing crisis, and we recognize that confronting the crisis and the demand and working with our policymakers to advance solutions to facilitate the production of hundreds of thousands of new units of housing as soon as possible. We are hopeful that to the extent that this Charter Review Commission considers amendments to ULURP, the Commission's proposals will balance the pressing need to build more housing with the importance of preserving representation democracy in the review process. Thank you, guys.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Annie Levers, and I'm testifying this evening on behalf of Brad Lander, New York City Comptroller and mayoral candidate. I'd like to thank Chair Bury, the commissioners, and the commission staff for convening this hearing. Over the last several years, Brad Lander has proposed a robust set of charter revision proposals, ranging from strengthening the city's fair share rules to modernizing its fiscal framework. Given the commission's emphasis tonight on land use reforms, my testimony this evening will focus exclusively on proposals for tackling the city's housing crisis. To boost New York City's housing supply, build political consensus for growth, and ensure that expansion is backed by critical investments in infrastructure, Brad's housing plan proposed revisions that would allow the city to immediately expedite rezonings for increased density while laying the groundwork for a long-term comprehensive plan, a best practice that Brad has championed for decades, but that the city has failed to implement. These recommendations are aligned with proposals from ANHD, the Thriving Communities Coalition, and Open New York to make the city's fair housing framework enforceable. The charter should be amended to empower the mayor to declare a temporary housing emergency, alongside mechanisms to streamline and fast-track new development. Under this framework, the mayor would convene a citizens' assembly to address the housing crisis, the affordability and homelessness crisis, no less than 100 days after the declaration of the emergency. The Citizens Assembly would be a group of randomly selected, diverse New Yorkers who are unencumbered by the entrenched interests and political dynamics that too often stall out growth. The Assembly would be required to develop and adopt plans for increased density and transit-oriented growth that fulfill the targets and mandates of the city's fair housing framework. These plans would provide New Yorkers with more detailed land use and infrastructure visions for their neighborhoods. The Citizens Assembly plan would be sent to the community boards, borough presidents, and the New York City Council, requiring a 2/3 council vote to reject the plan altogether. For rezoning actions that the City Planning Commission determines comply with the Citizens Assembly plans, the charter would establish an alternative, streamlined 90-day ULURP review and public comment period. That would bring the ULURP clock from roughly 7 months to 90 days. Rezoning actions that comply with the Citizens Assembly plan would not be subject to council review or approval. To supplant the emergency process, the charter should then be amended to require the development of a comprehensive plan no less than 2 years since the start of the housing emergency. The adopted comprehensive plan in place, the charter would be amended to make permanent that 90-day streamlined ULURP process. Additionally, I strongly encourage the commission to put the original City of Yes proposal on the ballot to New Yorkers to deliver the additional 20,000 units that were lost after negotiations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this evening. I've attached more details to my written testimony, which you'll all receive, and I would be happy to meet with each of you and the staff to discuss these in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to applaud each of you for testifying with me. Are there any questions from the panel?
I actually have one. Can you cite an example where, whenever I hear citizens assembly,
Indeed, yeah.
some could view that as adding another layer and want to reject it outright. Can you give me an example where that has been one where it's actually encouraged greater buy-in versus created more tension?
Sure. Well, I'll start first by just making clear that the point of the comprehensive plan itself and the way it's used in other cities has always been to develop buy-in and build political consensus citywide on these individual neighborhood level issues. So that's why it works in other jurisdictions. You bring the plan to the council And the council has to agree to address the crisis, right? Citywide, each council member is forced to take a little bit. They've already taken leadership in this area by passing the fair housing framework. So there's clearly some buy-in to this concept that there is a need to deliver citywide housing in every neighborhood. The comprehensive plan does exactly that. I think a big critique of comprehensive planning has been that it takes too long and it sits on a shelf and never gets implemented. And what this proposal is designed to do is address those two critiques. We would create a citizens assembly, which has been used. I mean, my favorite example is it's actually used in legislative areas. So it was used in Ireland to dramatically expand abortion rights in a country that would not otherwise actually be inclined to do so, through this sort of diverse body of people that were randomly selected jury duty style to actually just learn about the issue and vote on what they really saw was the right thing to do. So that's an example of where it's been used previously. But the idea is that it would take the fair housing framework, it would get information from city agencies and independent experts, many of whom are in this room, on sort of where the crisis is, hitting hardest in communities, and build a land use plan for each district so that council members have a somewhat clearer sense of where in their district growth is going to go. And that could help build some consensus. They would then adopt that plan, and then they would forgo their review from there.
Does that sort of like, is that similar to the process with community boards and stuff like that, or is this different?
Outside of that.
So this it would exist outside of it. It would be a temporary body. It would be convened within, 100 days of the mayor declaring the emergency. And within 6 months of being convened, it would deliver these plans. The plans would then go to community boards, which are obviously critical and have a lot of input and context, for comment. And the whole plan would go to the council for a vote, but it would exist outside of community boards.
Could I just ask you, regarding that, how would you account for the dynamic nature of the city and the diversity of the city in terms of having a plan that was done and then would need to be redone again? What is your thought about how often this would have to be done? Because that's one of the challenges that we have in the city, is its dynamic nature.
Yeah. So the Citizens Assembly plan, we are hoping would only need to happen once. I think we all agree that we're in a housing emergency right now. What that would do would lay the groundwork for a real 10-year comprehensive planning cycle where, best practices show that you should create a whole new plan every 10 years that, takes in account the context of what's gone on over the last 10 years, what you predict to happen in the future 10 years, with opportunities for amendments about 5 years in.
I'm curious to understand. So the council would still have to vote on the plan?
That's the idea.
Okay. So an emergency to develop a plan that the council still votes on, and then projects go through, assuming the council's voted on a plan and
Indeed.
agrees with it. Okay.
And creating that higher threshold for them to just outright reject the plan, I think, can help build the consensus.
Okay.
Can I ask,
I just want to finish. I'm curious, because you both mentioned the importance of democracy and democratic processes. Also acknowledging a housing emergency is something that maybe well-housed people shouldn't be voting on, the types of projects or the need for certain types of projects. How would you, how do you think about this balance of what is a necessary democratic process versus acknowledging it's an emergency that needs quick, fast action?
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead? Okay. I think what this does is actually strengthen our forms of democracy by creating a new process, basically, that still allows for consensus to be built with opportunities for input along the way. And I think that there are lots of things that would come out through that emergency process that could be addressed through a longer term comprehensive plan. But this would create sort of an immediate relief mechanism to make sure that the targets that are put in the city's fair housing framework, which I think everyone agrees is like a critical framework for actually addressing the crisis, can actually be implemented, because otherwise it's just another plan that's going to sit on a shelf.
Just to add to that, I think a big part of the democratic process that us as a union sees is the ability for our membership to have a voice in a process that they wouldn't be aware of or a part of, right? And so we're that governing body for them. So I think the democratic process for us is really shown in those relationships that we build and making sure that the good job parameters are seen and that advocacy is done through our voice as representing that larger membership base, which is around 90,000 and in all vast communities in all different boroughs of the city.
When you describe a comprehensive plan, how comprehensive is comprehensive? Do that include schools, sanitation needs, transportation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it would. I mean, the proposal that that I think makes sense for the city to pursue is one that actually integrates the city's 10-year capital strategy, which outlines all of our city's planning for that kind of infrastructure with our land use plans. And what that requires is the city to first and foremost do an assessment of the state of good repair of our infrastructure, which we are not currently doing a great job at. So it would start there and look at where we need to make repairs. First and foremost, prioritize the areas that need those investments and then match that with a land use plan that actually makes sure that the areas experiencing significant growth are being matched with the infrastructure they need to support it.
And what would you say to those who might say that the mere complexity of that plan, not only the sort of the surface complexity, but the need to engage with the MTA, other bodies, or not even necessarily city bodies, risk creating something that is so complex and difficult that in fact, the process gets buried under the weight of the plan itself?
I think that's why you need clear timeframes. Like, I agree that it is not a good idea to let the planning process go on forever. In part because I think it will just bog down community conversations and actually erode public trust in government and just give everyone planning fatigue. So I think what makes sense is to have a timeline for actually developing the plan that creates room for building true consensus among community members and making sure that people have an opportunity to weigh in without letting it go on forever.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your testimony. Thank you. Next up, we have, next up, we have DeRay McKesson and Cassandra Paso. And just so that they know, following them will be Abdul Rad and Hassan Naweed. Thank you so much. Okay. Where's the clock? Please, whoever wants to go first.
Hello, I'm DeRay McKesson, the Executive Director of Campaign Zero, an organization that works to end police violence and mass incarceration across the country. But my first job and the honor of my life was being a sixth grade math teacher in Starrett City in East New York. Sixth grade is still the best.
Once again, I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
Shout out East New York.
I want those seconds back.
That's also in Brooklyn, Chair. I just want to make sure.
Sixth grade is still the best grade of middle school to teach. I'm not here to talk about housing directly, but I am here to talk about public safety. And we think about public safety as the only issue that touches all of the other issues, that people think about safety a lot, both in this city and around the country. And there's no way to talk about safety without talking about the police. We also think that the issue of accountability is key to talking about the issue of safety if we talk about it at all. The CCRB, as you know, exists, and the power to discipline any police officer in New York City is rested in the charter, and the charter is clear that the police chief is the only person who has the power to discipline an officer. So the CCRB right now functions as a review and advisory body. They make a lot of recommendations, some of which are ignored and some of which are heeded by. But I'll tell you, when we look at the data over time, we have seen that commissioners have just wholesale dismissed many of the recommendations of the CCRB. And the question becomes, is it really oversight if they can write recommendations, they can do investigations, and they actually lead to nothing? When I think about what I told my students, what I tell people as organizers, is that we should make structures that work independent of whether the people who hold the roles are people we like, people we don't like. And right now we have a structure that actually doesn't work, that it is beholden to who the mayor is and who the police chief is. And there are some concrete ways that we can actually change this. We can give the CCRB the power to actually discipline officers. It have to be in accordance with the discipline matrix, which is robust here in the city. When I think about the work that we've done, we've reviewed more police union contracts and discipline systems across the country. So we've done an analysis of 3,000 discipline systems across the country of the police. And there's a real opportunity here. And the last thing that I'll say is that if we are able to give the CCRB the power to discipline, this would not be an outlier in some of the major cities. There are cities across the country, major police departments, where the police chief is either not the only person who can discipline a police officer, or there's some places like LA where the police chief actually cannot fire a police officer at all on his own. He has to go through another process. So I say this to say that I think it's possible. The only people who are not in favor of this largely are the police. And what people say is that if this happens, police will quit, things like that. There's a 2020 study by Grunwald that says that police officers who choose to leave are not leaving because of the protests or accountability. They're leaving for a host of other reasons. So I'll stop there with 10 seconds to spare.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Cassandra Apasso. I'm a proud New York City resident and also the policy director at Campaign Zero, an organization committed to ending police violence and carceral violence through data-informed policy solutions. First, I want to thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak before you today. I'm here to speak in support of critical reforms to the New York City Charter that would strengthen the Civilian Complaint Review Board, as Dre mentioned, the CCRB, and restore public trust in our systems of policy oversight. The CCRB is intended to provide independent, transparent, and impartial civilian oversight of the NYPD by allowing the public to file complaints against officers and have those complaints investigated outside of the police department itself. Right now, the CCRB is failing to carry out this mandate. While its mission is to ensure accountability, it lacks the authority to enforce its decisions. Its work is often obstructed by limited access to NYPD records, long investigation delays, and a system where the police commissioner can ignore or overturn its disciplinary recommendations, and in 70% of cases, it does. This gross dereliction renders the CCRB powerless and leaves New York City without real accountability. Simply put, the CCRB cannot fulfill its intended mission in its current form. Let's be clear. New Yorkers deserve a police accountability system that is independent, transparent, and effective. That's why we need reforms in the hands of voters through ballot measures. These changes are essential to realign oversight with public expectations, not political convenience. Our first recommendation is make the CCRB independent. Today, the mayor controls 9 of 15 board appointments, creating a lopsided structure that undermines the board's independence. We propose expanding this board to 21 members and reforming the appointment process to limit political influence and ensure broader representation of New Yorkers. We also recommend a 60-day term limit for interim chairs. Why? Because open-ended interim appointments sidestep accountability and weaken the city council's role in governance. Currently, all board member vacancies must be filled within 60 days, and we are asking that the same is applied to the chair position, the most important of all. Second, the CCRB must have direct access to NYPD misconduct databases. Currently, the NYPD controls the flow of misconduct records, meaning they determine what information is shared. No accountability system would allow these subjects to review the control of information, and in this case, it forces the CCRB to rely on subpoenas that are frequently delayed or ignored. A 2020 ProPublica investigation found that NYPD routinely fails to provide the CCRB with essential records and body-worn cam footage, particularly in the most severe of cases. This information sharing obstructs investigations and delays justice. We propose direct access to the NYPD misconduct database so that oversight is timely, complete, and independent. Third, and most importantly, the CCRB's disciplinary decisions must be final. Even when the CCRB substantiates misconduct and recommends discipline, almost finished, I promise, the police commissioner can and most often does overrule them 70% of the time. This gross failure renders the board's work as merely symbolic rather than substantive, and the public's faith in oversight evaporates. We must give the CCRB binding disciplinary authority so accountability is not just a recommendation, but a guarantee. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
Thank you both for your testimony. You alluded to some other models for enforcement. I think, and if you know it, it's fine, but you could submit it subsequently. I'd be interested to know in those models, is there evidence that they either decrease complaints and/or repeated instances of misconduct?
Yeah, so there are other models. We don't love those either, but they do exist. So in Wisconsin, there's an ancient law in Wisconsin that allows a police and fire commission to terminate any officer, including the police chief. The problem with that model is that all of the people in those commissions are appointed by the mayor. So, questionable whether it is used, but does it exist? Yes. In LA, after it sort of came after Rodney King, there's a board of rights. So the police chief can recommend termination and the board of rights has to say yes or no. The problem with the board of rights is that up until a couple years ago, it was all police on the board of rights. That is, wouldn't choose that. And then the other option is all civilians, but they are all lawyers. And the data shows that police officers are more likely to get disciplined if they choose the police panel and not the civilian panel, because the civilians aren't what I think people intended when they did the civilian model. Chicago also has a very complicated model where if there's disagreement amongst the oversight agencies, it goes to another group and da-da-da. So none of the ones that exist, we love structurally, but there is no CCRB that exists as robust as the New York City model. So a lot of the oversight agencies that exist are like either paltry or they sort of don't have staff or they don't have, people don't make complaints. And this one is robust. They have real investigations. They make real recommendations, but they have no power. That is sort of like the rub here.
My question is about expanding it to 21. So are you saying that you also want to make sure that the mayor only gets to appoint 9? Is that what part of that? So even if you could, or send that in, but you don't, I'm curious to hear just a little bit more on that. You don't even have to answer, but it'd be great to have that fleshed out in a.
So we actually,
submitted.
we have the edits to the charter that we would love to see. I think we only make 6 copies because it's a long document, so
Okay.
we can send that to you. So Cassie will answer the details, but what we're trying to do is have no one political member appoint a majority. So we are adding people to the process.
Totally get that. The other than expanding it, are there particularly in the 21 representation that is not there now that you have recommendations you'd like to see?
Yeah, our proposal is that, so currently, there is 1 appointment per borough by the city council. We recommend increasing that to 2 appointments per borough by the city council. We believe that would be a broader representation of New Yorkers at large. And similarly, we actually recommend that we add an appointment by the city comptroller. We believe that this is kind of an additional voice that would help with additional representation.
Thank you.
And we added the comptroller, as you know, New York City has a record number of settlements that the comptroller's office manages with regard to police misconduct. So when we included the comptroller, we didn't do it sort of out of left field. It was like, we actually think that the comptroller's office has a different lens on police accountability. And we've actually been trying to work with that office under a previous comptroller to see if we can actually identify streets and like neighborhoods where police misconduct is centralized from misconduct database, but that's why we added the comptroller.
Thank you.
A few other follow-up questions. One, following up on Commissioner Nieves's question. Given that the CCRB, as you say, is robust, is making recommendations, can you say a little bit more about what is the problem with the current makeup? If it's making recommendations, then the problem is these commissioners override power?
Yeah, so the fundamental problem that we see with the makeup now is that the board doesn't operate independently if the majority of the members can change when the mayor changes. So that is generally our take on this, is that the board should be one that is not subject to the whims of who the mayor is or who the police chief is. The police get 3 appointees. We're fine with that. That makes sense to us. But trying to make sure that the mayor's office doesn't have an outsized role in the CCRB running, I think makes sense. And the way the interim appointment of the chair works is that the mayor can just appoint an interim that sort of lasts forever, bypassing the other processes to make sure that there is a real appointment process. So what we would do and what we propose in the backup that we've given to some of you, but that we will send, is that if the mayor does not appoint a real chair after the time limit, then the appointment power goes to another political leader, so that we can make sure that there's actually a chair of the CCRB and that no one political leader can hamstring the CCRB from functioning, which is what happens now. So when we look at the data, you look at 2018, Commissioner O'Neill sided 83% with the CCRB. And then today, it's sort of the exact opposite. It's like, the commissioner is only agreeing to about 30% of them, not actually giving over the materials. And we've learned a lot in the past decade. I think 10 years ago, people were asking for subpoena power. They were like, let the oversight agency subpoena. Nobody anticipated that subpoenas would be denied. And then all of a sudden, they just didn't get anything, right? So the question, what we've learned is like, there should actually be direct access so that you don't have to go through the legal process or have the agency fight, get the subpoena denied, create precedent, and then you're sort of hamstrung in the accountability process.
On information access, are there any privacy concerns around giving CCRB investigators direct access to body cam footage or other kinds of data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Seattle and Chicago are two examples that have, and Washington DC that have this direct access that we're proposing. In
Chicago and Seattle, you said?
Chicago, Seattle, and Washington DC. Unfettered access to police records does not mean full public disclosure. Chicago's COPA, for example, states very clearly that their investigatory files and reports, while relying on access to relevant police records, will not be divulged to any personal agency. So, that both the CCRB and NYPD are both part of the city, and that does not mean like that these records are going to be public. It's just that CCRB is able to do their job with due diligence within the time frame that they need to do it.
I'm sorry, I have one final question. Is there anything in state law, and I'm sorry, people in the room, the acoustics here are very loud, so if you even whisper, I can hear. So if you can try to step outside if you need to have a conversation. Is there anything in state law, the collective bargaining agreement, that impacts the police commissioner's final authority?
So not the bargaining agreement. So we have the only database of police union contracts in the country. Most places do bargain discipline. New York City, the NYPD cannot bargain discipline because the charter precludes it. With the charter saying that the police chief is the only person that can discipline, that removes this as a bargainable topic. So in that case, no, not subject to bargaining. We do have language that we would like for you to use that doesn't open us up to bargaining later, because I think it is a good thing that we don't bargain discipline in the city. There is no state law that precludes the CCRB from having the power to discipline. When this topic comes up, there's a lot of emotional arguments about why this is necessarily a bad thing. It is not an illegal thing.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is New York City. So you might have heard of the Rochester case in 2023, where the oversight board, it was ruled that they did not have final disciplinary decision power. What's different about New York City is that Rochester relinquished that control in 1985. New York City has never relinquished that control. So Taylor's law does not apply in the case of New York City. And so because of that, because the New York City Charter dictates, who has final disciplinary decision power, state law isn't relevant in New York City specifically.
And what Cassie means by relinquished control, there was a period in Rochester where they did negotiate and bargain discipline. That is not the case in New York City. It has always been very clear that the police chief is the sole arbiter of discipline.
Because of the New York City Charter.
Because of the charter.
Any further questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next up is Abdul Rad and Hassan Naweed. They'll be followed by Ben Kalos and Brendan Cheney.
Good evening, commissioners. How's everyone holding up?
Well,
Love that. Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to testify on an issue that's been important to me as both a lifelong New Yorker and as someone who's devoted their career to working on public safety and police reinvention. My name is Abdul Nasser Rad, and I serve as the Managing Director for Research and Data at Campaign Zero. Publicly available data makes one thing unmistakably clear. The CCRB is currently structured. The way the CCRB is currently structured cannot hold the NYPD accountable. Before I discuss the data underscoring the issues crippling the CCRB, I want to provide some information on my background and experiences I've had as an applied public safety researcher in both government and nonprofit sectors. In government, I worked at the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice up until 2021, where I managed several research portfolios, including the New York City Office of Neighborhood Safety and the beginning of the Police Reinvention and Implementation Task Force. In the nonprofit sector, I was the public safety researcher at the Vera Institute, where I advised law enforcement agencies across the U.S. through Department of Justice grants on comprehensive efforts to improve safety. And relevant to this conversation is my doctoral research at the University of Oxford, focused on police violence and accountability. My colleagues spoke a little bit about the policy recommendations. I'm here to talk a little bit more about the why and the data behind it. So from 2000 to 2020, despite investigating over 180,000 complaints, fewer than 2% resulted in any NYPD discipline. In 2021, the NYPD enacted changes that would ensure, quote, ensure greater transparency around the disciplinary process, most notably the strengthening of the disciplinary matrix and making this disciplinary matrix public. The theory being that transparency in the commissioner's decision complying or not complying with the matrix would improve accountability. Despite the changes, the 2024 CCRB data renders a disturbing image that proves reforms were meaningless. 2024 CCRB data showed that NYPD administered discipline in fewer than 2% of cases, no real difference from 2000 to 2020. Without granting power to the CCRB to both fully investigate and make disciplinary recommendations final, there will be no real accountability or transparency. In 2024, CCRB substantiated 1,057 cases of misconduct. The NYPD declined to act, as my colleague mentioned, in 890 of them, often citing timing issues tied to the statutes of limitations. These outcomes are not the result of a lack of misconduct. The CCRB received 12,698 complaints alleging police misconduct in 2024, the highest volume since 2012. Yet systemic barriers continue to prevent meaningful accountability. They reflect structural deficiencies that inhibit independent oversight. I would request just maybe 15 to 30 more seconds, if that's all right. Thank you, commissioners. Delayed access to critical evidence, a lack of final disciplinary authority, and governance structures that expose the CCRB to political influence all contribute to a system where accountability is the exception rather than the rule. These persistent failures highlight why targeted reforms are urgently needed. Expanding the size of the CCRB, limiting the interim chair's term, and providing direct access, as my colleague mentioned, are all critical. The broader data environment continues to reinforce the same theory. Oversight without real power is oversight in name only. Today, the Charter Review Commission has an opportunity to strengthen accountability and ensure that the CCRB becomes an institution capable of delivering the accountability New Yorkers deserve. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Hassan Naveed. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify tonight. I'm here to urge the Commission to amend the City Charter to give CCRB final authority to impose discipline in cases where misconduct by NYPD officers has been substantiated. Over the past decade, I've worked across New York City government and public service and police oversight. As director and special investigator at the Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD at the city's Department of Investigation, I was part of multiple investigations into NYPD practices, including a landmark report on biased policing that helped establish the CCRB's bias policing unit. I later served as the first deputy executive director and then the executive director of the New York City Mayor's Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes, where I led the citywide efforts to prevent hate violence, launched the first hate crime curriculum in public schools, expanded safety programs across all 5 boroughs, and coordinated rapid responses to emerging threats. Throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to build new systems, implement policy reform, improve government efficiency, fight corruption, and see firsthand that many benefits of effective accountability and how easily they can evaporate when not enforced or institutionalized. As someone who has worked closely with NYPD and deeply respects the many officers who serve with integrity and dedication, I've seen firsthand their commitment to public service. But that good work is undermined when the disciplinary system is inconsistent or unenforced. Let me be clear. What I'm asking for is practical, necessary, and long overdue. I'm not calling for the CCRB to impose harsher punishments. We need the CCRB to have the authority as it was intended to have and enforce discipline in cases where police misconduct has been substantiated through a thorough, independent investigative process. Too often, even after thorough investigations and clear findings of misconduct, cases end without consequences. This is particularly unfortunate given the commitment of so many NYPD officers who serve with integrity every day. It erodes trust, morale, and legitimacy from within. I commend NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch for her efforts to modernize the department and strengthen accountability tools, showing that internal reform is possible with strong leadership. Still, lasting public trust requires more than leadership alone. Commissioners change, but policies must endure. We need systems that are consistent, transparent, and accountable, no matter who is at the helm. The CCRB was created to provide meaningful civilian oversight, not to make recommendations that can be dismissed without consequence. Granting the board final disciplinary authority would send a clear message. Oversight is essential, and accountability shouldn't depend on who's in charge. Just 10 more seconds, if you don't mind. When misconduct is substantiated through a full CCRB investigation, discipline should follow. This isn't about harsher penalties. It's about closing the loop of accountability. New Yorkers deserve a system they can trust, and officers deserve one that is fair and consistent. This reform would restore integrity to a broken process and move us from symbolic oversight to real accountability. Thank you for your time.
Questions?
Yes, I was struck by the testimony before you that under Commissioner O'Neill, 80% of the CCRB disciplinary recommendations were upheld, and now 30% are upheld. Is that dramatic change simply due to the views of the commissioner, or are there other factors at play?
I mean, I won't be able to speak to what the commissioner's thinking on those things. As we stated, the issue is around the structures, and as Hassan's mentioned, who's at the helm. And we're trying to advocate for a system where who's at the helm it does not dictate accountability.
And this speaks at a time when we're looking at complaints at a record high. We've seen just in the last year itself, 12,000 complaints. This is the highest since 2012 that have been filed against officers that have been, I guess, alleged misconduct.
I'm just not sure you're answering my question, or maybe you're not capable of answering my question, but is it the dramatic change simply due to the views of the commissioner at the time, or are there other factors at play? For example, the different nature of cases that are determined by the CCRB now versus 10 years ago or 8 years ago with Commissioner O'Neill?
Let me try to respond to that, Commissioner. So as I started, the data that from 2000 to 2020 still showed that that NYPD administered in still fewer than 2% of cases. So that is the data for 2 decades. Now, Commissioner O'Neill being having a different administration of, or a compliance, whatever you'd like to call it, that can't say what the case is for that year, but on average is what we're talking about. So again, on average, this is an issue.
Yeah, and again, discipline resides within the discretion of the police commissioner, and how the police commissioner is carrying out really leads it to that decision-making process. I can't speak to what goes into the commissioner's mind themselves in that decision-making process. But what we can say is that there is a situation where we're saying the disciplinary recommendations have only, in this particular case, 30% of the time compared to previous commissioners. I'd also add that CCRB did testify not too long ago on the matter of it being granted, of it itself advocating for disciplinary powers to be given to the agency itself, sort of recognizing the fact that this is a matter of concern when we have this inconsistency, when we have this lack of balance, I guess, unenforcement, that is.
Can I sort of ask this? I'm trying to ask a slightly different way to see it. Is there any other independent factors that you can think of that could lead to that, have led to that change? Were there other policy changes, changes in the nature of complaints? Are there any other data that you might be able to point to?
Yeah, I mean, I would need to look at the specifics, and I'm happy to follow up in detail with the commission afterwards. We know that from year to year, there are changes. So specifically, I would need to know what year that was of Commissioner O'Neill's tenure, because there was, as we all know, the COVID pandemic and a bunch of other things. So the nature of those offenses and those things do change. So I would need to look at specifically the year and then slice the data to understand
Fair
if there
enough.
were certain differences. But again, 20 years of data and over 180,000 complaints show you that discipline was only administered in fewer than 2% of cases.
When you submit that data, could you separate the data pre-body cam usage and post-body cam usage?
Let's see what we could do.
Thank you.
I have one other question. Again, just sort of reflecting on the process. I mean, I think we think about disciplinary processes, it's comfortable thinking about there being an appeal. And so when we say that the CCRB recommendations would be final, that means there would be no appeal from that recommendation, even if it was not to the PC, there would be no appeal to that whatsoever.
You're saying if an officer appeals the
Yeah,
decision?
would there be any opportunity for an officer to appeal under this regime, just to anyone?
So I mean, it depends on whether, again, with the bargaining contract, whether there's a, binding arbitration agreement in there in New York. I would have to double check that in detail. So we'll follow up with the commission after that.
Any other? All right. Thank you so much for your testimony. Deeply appreciate it. Thank you. Next up, we have Benjamin Kalos and Brendan Cheney. Thank you. Councilman, you want to begin? Thank you so much.
Distinguished members of the Charter Revision Commission, thank you for your individual service to the people of this great city, for your partnership that I had with many of you when I served in the council, and for your service on this Charter Revision Commission. Through Charter Revision, we've been able to empower voters to adopt big, bold changes that could not have been accomplished any other way. Following one charter revision where I testified, the voters adopted the 8-to-1 public matching that paved the way for the full public matching system I authored that allows anyone to run on small dollars. I prepared 3-minute summary of detailed testimony, which I welcome an opportunity to discuss further with commissioners and staff. I'm proposing 18 amendments to the charter along 6 main themes. The first theme is let's increase housing supply. Let's get a vacancy tax. There's 20,000 apartments previously used for short-term rental that are not back on the market. Let's expand the law I already authored to cover every multifamily housing unit and then tax the vacant units. Number 2, let's renovate and repair rent-regulated apartments. Let's get 90,000 rent-regulated apartments back on the market by overhauling, unlocking doors. Let's increase it from 25,000 a unit to 100,000 a unit. Let's use market rate housing to house the homeless. It costs the city $8,000 a month to shelter a family. I proposed with Fred Shack that we use this money to buy market rate apartments for homeless families in every community, including the Upper East Side. This would be less expensive, even on the Upper East Side, and it would be permanently affordable housing. While we're at it, number 4, stop predatory equity from buying houses for families. These are all things that you can do. You can change the charter. It's like being a council member. It's awesome. The second theme is deliver affordable housing for more New Yorkers. Let's set the median income for affordable housing to the census block instead of the area median income. The median household income in East Harlem neighborhood tabulation area, which I represented, was $39,490, while the area median income is $179,355. I think we should just use the local number. I don't think people making $180,000 should be getting that affordable housing. We can replace rent-regulated affordable housing torn down to make way for new mixed-income buildings. In my districts, we would regularly see 4 brownstones with 80 rent-regulated units replaced by a brand-new luxury building that had a fraction of the units and very little, if any, affordable housing. I'd also love to count the number of people getting affordable housing instead of units. This would reorient the city from studios and 1-bedrooms to 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms families actually need. Similarly, where the market has failed to actually build 2, 3, and 4 family units, we need to require it as part of every new development. Third theme, building more housing. I don't know how much more time I may be granted, but I'll just wrap up and
Yeah,
just
thank you.
say, there's a lot that we can do. We could also empower communities in the rezoning process. Please take a gander at the testimony. I know there's also been a lot of conversation around member deference. I read editorials about myself and member deference all the time. I'd just like to note that in my district, we had more housing starts than anywhere else in the city while I was a council member. The former planning chair can correct me on that. We had 1,000 units of affordable housing, including on Roosevelt Island where one of you lives. We welcomed new housing, shelters, and services for the homeless. And so I would really be interested to learn more about some of the questions about member deference, because I'm not sure where there's districts where there's no housing happening.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Brendan Cheney. I'm the Director of Policy and Operations at the New York Housing Conference. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. New York Housing Conference is a nonprofit affordable housing policy and advocacy organization. As a broad-based coalition, our mission is to advance city, state, and federal policies and funding to support the development and preservation of decent, affordable housing for all New Yorkers. You've got my full testimony, but I'm going to try and summarize it so I can fit it all in the time I have. When I testified in the Bronx, I shared information and data about the extent of the housing crisis and shared data that you guys have already heard, just showing how affordable housing is not distributed equally across the city. We have our New York City housing tracker that shows that data. We're updating that data probably next week with the latest information, and it's going to show the same thing that we've been seeing in the past. Nothing's changing. It's the same unequal distribution across the city. And so unless we make changes, next year's housing tracker is going to show the same thing as this year's housing tracker, as last year's housing tracker, that we have really unequal distribution across the city. So when we thought about what to recommend to you all, we focused on three main issues, right? How can we create an easier approval process for affordable housing? How can we create a faster process for housing development? And how can we make housing and zoning decisions with more of a borough-wide and citywide approach? With that focus, we came up with several recommendations, which I will summarize. First of all, two recommendations that we think would make an easier approval process for affordable housing. First, you've already heard Howard talk about it, but this sort of fast track for affordable housing through the Board of Standards and Appeals, waiving the rezoning for that project. And then secondly, allowing for affordable housing on city-owned land should not have to go through ULURP if it meets the underlying zoning. So sort of exempt that. Affordable housing, city-owned land should not have to go through ULURP. Specifically for ULURP and housing development, we recommend building on the city's fair housing framework by shortening the ULURP process so that in districts that are not meeting their fair housing framework goals, the ULURP process would end at the City Planning Commission. And then finally, just a few shorter proposals. Let's see. Shortening the ULURP process, we support merging the borough president and community board review into one review that's shorter and that would be under the focus of the borough president. We think you could have a shorter timeline, but also one that has a better, less toxic review process. And then small and minor projects, we support going through the borough, stopping at the borough president. A lot of small projects don't go through ULURP because it's too expensive. And then finally, smaller changes that we think should not have to go through ULURP, like special permits, revocable consents, concessions, things like that.
Hi. Yes. Thank you both for your testimony. Former City Council person, good to see you. And thank you for mentioning the AMI versus census block. It's been a thing of mine for like close to 30 years. I've been in the business, so thank you for that. I had a question in relation to the 20,000 short-term units that you referenced that should go back on market in every single type of multifamily structure. Do you mean every single type of multifamily structure, and precisely what type of short-term units are you talking about? Were they the the Airbnb or whatever, yeah.
Thank you. A publication called Skiff did a deep dive onto the law I wrote on short-term regulation and found that the 20,000 short-term rentals had not been put back on the market. Local Law 64, which I wrote, governs affordable housing subsidized by the city and requires all of those affordable housing units to register. In my more detailed testimony, I suggest expanding Local Law 64, so it would be multifamily housing with 10 or more units, as well as if one person owned 10 or more units across multiple buildings. So we're trying to target some of the larger landlords and then making sure that as part of that registration, we're putting in a vacancy tax so that if they try to leave their units off the market in order to kind of drive up prices, it would actually mean that they couldn't do it. There's buildings in my district with 400 vacant units, and that just shouldn't be when we're trying to increase housing supply.
Right, because the reason I was questioning, I was thinking of the family that, poor family house that might have a vacant unit, and was that who you were talking about?
No.
Okay.
We
so,
exempted
but
that
I
from
wasn't
Local Law
aware.
64
I'll
as
look
well.
at the law. Thank you.
No, you got it.
Yeah. Thanks for your testimony. Brendan, first, thanks so much for New York Housing Conference's great advocacy all across the city for housing, and the report you guys do on the distribution of development, I think, has been a really helpful tool for folks to really understand the distribution of where housing is getting built and where it's not. Former council member, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your perspective on what the city can be doing. It sounds like you have all these great housing ideas. We can't bring all of them to voters, which is what the charter revision process requires. And some of them could be put in a housing plan. But for these districts that build little to no housing, partly because there's really no way to compel, and there's a process that really does put the final vote in a local council member's hands, and acknowledging that, it's been 16 years since we've had a housing project go through without the local council members' vote. Curious what you think the city should do to create more housing in neighborhoods that have not done very much. According to the Housing Conference's report too, I think in your district, I think only 488 units got built between 2014 and 2023. So I'm not sure where the 1,000 is you're coming from, but
Sure.
just curious to get your ideas on what we can do in neighborhoods and districts where little to no housing has been getting built.
So I might ask some of my colleagues who served at city planning. So what's detailed in my testimony is an issue, which is in order to put up new housing in a city that is largely built, they have to tear down buildings. And so in my district, there's 4, 5, and 6-story buildings that are old and therefore often rent regulated. So you're losing 80 rent regulated apartments where the rents are anywhere between $80 a month. I have tenants who are rent controlled who are paying $80 a month to live in this great city, which is amazing. And people paying $1,000, and then they get moved out, they get pushed out, they get bought out, and then we get a 20-story building or 30-story building with luxury development starting at $1 million a unit. Sometimes they have affordable housing in them, so we might get, if it's got 40 units, 20% will get 8 units of affordable housing. The city will pay several $100,000 or $1 million per unit of subsidized affordable housing. And so the number issue that you're talking about is between that and the fact that there aren't enough 2, 3, or 4 bedrooms in my district, between the loss of the regulated housing and people combining units. That's why you have that number of 400 when we had more housing starts than anywhere else. But in terms of how to help people get more units of affordable housing in their districts, later in my testimony, I suggest doing real, honest to goodness community planning. In Melissa Marco's Rito district, who represented more of East Harlem than I did, she funded a community-based group to do honest to goodness community planning, and they put forward a community-based upzoning. That upzoning, I think that the speaker at the time felt that city planning did not listen to that, and they came back with their own plan.
But that's a neighborhood that's produced a lot of housing. I'm asking about neighborhoods where very little housing has gotten built.
So I think where I'm going with this is if for districts that don't have a speaker who can fund a community group to do it. And in my district, I actually raised money to do my own rezoning, which the city planning did accept. So I think one of the solutions I'm proposing is for you to create a fund to support communities that want to have organizations that work with community members to do a community-led upzoning, and then pair them with urban planners and the land use professionals to actually put forward community plans. Because right now, residents can say, let's do an upzoning. The community board can pass a resolution, but it's up to city planning whether or not they do anything with it. And so I would really push strongly for giving those urban planners to the community board so that they can come back with their plans.
Do you have any ideas for neighborhoods that don't want to do community planning and are saying they don't want new housing, but we're saying we have a citywide crisis and every neighborhood should be evaluated for where it can be building housing?
I honestly was curious as I heard the commissioners talking about neighborhoods, because I think there might be a conception it was the Upper East Side, but we were fighting to get affordable housing and homeless shelters, and we voted for them. So I'm not sure where those neighborhoods are. In the council, we were all trying to push for more affordability. And I'll be honest, there's a memo I gave to the de Blasio administration with, I think, several sites to upzone to build homeless beds. I asked the mayor if we could please just upzone a block so that a church could put beds for homeless, either permanent housing or shelter beds, above the church. And they came back and said, we don't have the money, your district's too expensive. And two, we don't want to go through the ULURP process, even if you're on board, Senator Kruger's on board, and your borough president, Gail Brewer, is on board. So
Okay. Well, I
my
would point you to Housing Conference's report if you want to know the districts that have not been producing any housing. You said you don't know where they are, and I know you're data driven, so I think you should take a look at their
concerned
report.
that data may not reflect. I was looking at some of the data on my way as I was drafting the testimony, and I'm concerned that it's not. I'm happy to go over the data with you. I'd be interested.
Yes, please. The data is from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Department of City Planning.
Great.
Any question? No? Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Next up, we have Moses Gates and Dina Tassi-Winter. I please apologize if I'm misspelling, if I mispronounce that. And just so you know, next up will be Anne Marie Gray and Michelle De La Uz.
Hello. Hello.
You can hear you.
Thanks so much. First, even though she is not here, I feel compelled to tell you all that I have had the rarest of New York experiences, a Brooklyn sighting of Gail Brewer. It was, I think, close to 20 years ago. And if I can remember correctly, it was a Tenants and Neighbors Conference.
It happened.
Thank you. My name is Moses Gates. I'm from Regional Plan Association, a nonprofit
I'm
civic
sorry,
association.
I'm sorry to interrupt you for 1 second. I'll honor the time. Our AS American Sign Language translators leave at 8 p.m. I just want to make sure that no one who is still planning to testify or in the room needs ASL. If they do, we will ask them to stay, but we will relieve them if no one needs them.
Sign language.
I'm sorry, American Sign Language. I apologize. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. So please continue. We'll start your time over.
Thank you. I'm glad to know that Gail Brewer story didn't cut into my time. My name is Moses Gates. I'm Vice President of Housing at Regional Plan Association. We do research planning and advocacy in the greater New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan region. I wanted to testify today on more the overarching goals we believe that the Commission should consider with respect to land use and housing. And we have more specifics that we'll submit kind of in more written testimony. It's evident we have a problem meeting citywide needs. Right now, that need is housing. That need has not always been housing, and it won't be housing in the future. And we need to think about reforming the land use process in ways where we're able to meet both our current, present, and future needs. And it should be noted there is no one land use process. We have ULURP. Some things are subject to ULURP. Many things are not subject to ULURP. And in much of the testimony from city council members and others, we I feel like have a thematic consensus, and the thematic consensus is different levels of government should work together to produce the things that New York City needs. And I think everybody on the commission and everybody we've heard testimony is aligned with that. There are different ways to meet that. The School Construction Authority is not subject to ULURP, and nobody is saying that it should be, and nobody says that the way we build schools in New York City is a crisis of democracy. So there are different ways of going about this. We wanted to highlight a few different ways that we think the process should be balanced in terms of local and citywide interests and voices. So first of all, having, when it comes to individual land use applications, we, like many others who have testified, believe the process is imbalanced and too deferential to the individual council member. There are many ways to change this, one of which is to have some kind of appeals process using existing institutions like the Bureau of Standards and Appeals, which is able to overrule land use applications on the basis of the interests of the individual developer, but currently not able to overrule that same land use application in terms of the interests of the people of New York City. So that is something that we think the commission should examine as ways to better rebalance that process and make sure that the process that all the council members described, and I want to really commend the three who testified for the projects they did in their district, as well as the council as a whole for doing City of Yes. I thought these were all excellent things that should not be generational undertakings as they are right now, and should be expanded to, as the commission members have pointed out, those districts that have less impetus to go forward. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Dina Tass-Winter, and I'm speaking on behalf of Village Preservation, a membership-based nonprofit that documents, celebrates, and preserves the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. I'm here today specifically to speak about housing because while we firmly believe that we should regularly review and reevaluate our government systems and bureaucracies, as has become apparent, destroying longstanding practices and standards merely for the sake of change will likely do more harm than good. So would deregulating industries that need careful oversight and dismantling systems for ensuring balanced and appropriate review of changes that will have a profound impact on our lives, neighborhoods, and city. Based on public statements made by Mayor Adams, who convened this body, we are concerned that this is exactly what the Commission has been charged to do. We strongly oppose efforts to deregulate developments in New York City or to remove common sense oversight, which ensures that environmental and other impacts of new development are adequately considered. We also strongly urge the Commission not to seek to strip away necessary checks and balances on the development process in our city and to ensure that neighborhood character and historic resources continue to be considered as important parts of the evaluation of appropriate new development in our neighborhoods. Our city is currently aiming to add thousands of units of new housing each year, but by far, most of these new developments are unaffordable to the vast majority of New Yorkers. And in too many cases, they replace older, more affordable existing housing stock. Both make our city's affordability crisis worse, not better. Instead of encouraging or enabling more unfettered development with less oversight, we urge this administration and this body to look at ways to preserve and make permanent the affordable housing we do have, and to ensure that new housing that we create is as affordable as possible. Deregulation and removal of critical elements of oversight, as the mayor has discussed doing, would not accomplish that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any commissioner questions for our speakers? Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. I think Michelle and Anne Marie, you're up next. And while they're coming up, I think next after them will be Carl Henry Cesar and Benji Ross. Thank you so much. Feel free to begin.
Great. Hello, good evening. My name is Anne Marie Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Open New York. We are an independent grassroots pro-housing nonprofit with hundreds of volunteer members across the state. I also spent nearly a decade in city government before this, many of them very deep in the ULURP process, especially focused on how to build housing in some of the most exclusive neighborhoods. Also, this is important enough that I'm back here to testify again for a second time on our top priority issue. So as has been talked about a lot tonight, right now we have a land use decision-making process that prefers the hyperlocal, preferences the hyperlocal, and the effects of our dire housing shortage are citywide. And so as been discussed, in every attempt to build new homes in the last 20-ish years, City Council has deferred to the local council member, giving them near absolute power to block and delay new homes. This drives up costs for all New Yorkers and deepens patterns of segregation and exclusion. Reminder that new housing is concentrated in so few neighborhoods that in 2024, only 10 community districts added as much new housing as the other 49 combined. So back in February, Open New York released a policy brief titled A Charter for Housing Equity, 5 Reforms for a Fairer, More Affordable New York City, which I encourage everyone to read in full. But today I'm just going to focus on our top priority recommendation to address this particular issue of member deference, which is create a fast track for fair housing. So we need an approval track for proposals that would advance fair housing in our most transit-rich, climate-resilient, and low-growth neighborhoods. They often are also the neighborhoods that are the whitest and the wealthiest. In line with the implementation of Speaker Adams's fair housing framework to actually give it real accountability, teeth, and enforcement. In these well-resourced neighborhoods, we must fast-track approvals to remove the ability for local council members to block new homes, which they continually do. For example, new proposals in these neighborhoods could finish the land use review process at the City Planning Commission. There could potentially be a representative from City Council on this, on the CPC for this process. What is most crucial, there are a lot of different ways to design this, but what's most crucial is that the council members representing these districts would no longer have the ability to block new proposals. Something that's come up a bit tonight is how you speed up the entire process, not just the actual ULURP clock. And I do want to definitely note that a huge amount of time is spent trying to game out the hyperlocal politics in advance, because that's the only path. So this would speed up the entire process even before the official clock starts. So a lot of these reforms are really common in other states. They often happen at the statewide level, known as builder's remedies. Albany has not acted, and so New York is very far behind, but a charter commission is an actual way you can really embrace this. And there are a lot of ways to design this really smartly. We're eager to continue to work with you all on these ideas, and this is a really, really rare chance to really tackle this, and the stakes are really high. Thank you.
Wow, right on time.
There we go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your service. I'm Michelle De La Luz, the Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, a 47-year-old nonprofit comprehensive community development corporation who's built over 1,500 units of affordable housing, and we have an affordable housing pipeline of another 2,000 units. I've also had the pleasure of sitting on the City Planning Commission with a number of you. Fifth Avenue Committee helped organize the community coalition that led to the Gowanus neighborhood rezoning, one of the most equitable rezonings in our city's history. I've also negotiated a number of community benefits agreements with private developers around private land use actions. And Fifth Avenue Committee has a project which is set for vote tomorrow, where one of 2 council members is likely to vote no on a 100% affordable housing project. So I have some insight into the things that you're considering. And some of the recommendations you've heard before, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I definitely think that our public processes should facilitate an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable city. And I am, Fifth Avenue Committee is part of the Thriving Communities Coalition at ANHD, and I certainly believe that a comprehensive plan is something that the city really should move towards. I think the Fair Housing Framework has been a step in that direction, and I believe that a comprehensive plan would take and balance the local concerns, the legitimate local concerns that many communities have with the citywide needs that a comprehensive plan could address. Absent a comprehensive plan, depending on the political appetite you all have, I think that in council districts that are not meeting the production goals that are outlined in the Fair Housing Framework, that ULURP should end at the City Planning Commission. I think that could help address a number of the concerns. Shifting the focus specifically to 100% affordable housing, I think that 100% affordable housing on city-owned land that conforms to underlying zoning, it does not need to go through ULURP. I think that the engagement with the local council member and the community boards is something that happens par course anyway, and is something that the agencies can mandate, doesn't need to happen on a clock. I also believe we should be consider merging the community board, and the borough president hearing, and have that sit at the borough president's office. And I believe that you should seriously consider for city-sponsored neighborhood rezonings that we mandate as part of the city charter a community-controlled oversight task force. It's something that we have as part of the Gowanus neighborhood rezonings. I've been involved in government and/or civic life in New York City for 35 years. It is the most productive relationship between government and community that I've ever seen. And one of the things that we really need to work on is building trust between community and government. And part of that happens after decisions are made, when communities are part of the implementation process. And happy to answer any questions you have.
I just wanted to know, because I've never heard of it, but what is a community oversight task force and how would that work?
The experience that we have in Gowanus, so as part of the 2021 neighborhood rezoning of 82 blocks that is bringing 8,500 units of housing, 3,000 of which are deeply and permanently affordable. It also included the commitments that were negotiated. It also included $200 million to invest in repairs at NYCHA locally and another, $250 million in other things. So we have a volunteer group of about 30 people that have gone through a process, basically said, raised their hands and said, we would like to be part of ensuring that the points of agreement that the city committed to are adhered to. And the number one point of agreement that the city of New York agreed to in 2021 was that the city would report to the community controlled task force and have public meetings on a quarterly basis. But in between then, there are conversations that are going on between task force members and staff at the agencies of the city of New York and the mayor's office. It's a very productive relationship.
And that's citywide?
No, that's
Gowanus.
only something that we
Each
secured as
neighborhood?
part of the
Wow.
Gowanus rezoning, and we had to raise our own money privately for our third-party facilitator.
I have a question. First, thank you both for all of your work in housing and all of your service. Michelle, I'm curious, you just have so much experience from a range of positions on trying to get affordable housing built in costly neighborhoods and over time. I'm curious if you could speak to how you see our land use process adding to the costs and challenges of building, because you've also negotiated a lot of community benefit agreements outside of ULURP. So it doesn't necessarily require ULURP always for communities to get what they want. But we also, as you know, the city's housing budget has grown over time, which is great. But what we've been able to do with that budget has not grown as equally because of how costly projects have become. And folks have talked about the pipeline and the backlog, which is partly because we don't have the right number of resources to actually build as much as we should. So we're able to do not as much even though our budget keeps growing, right? Because of how expensive projects have become. So could you just speak a little bit to what you see as the driving cost increases over the past handful of years? How much is that due to the land use process? How much of it is just due to building costs? Like because it really has become an exponential growth.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just has to do with uncertainty, right? Whether it's uncertainty of the cost of materials, uncertainty, especially since COVID, with supply chain issues. You guys have certainly mentioned a number of times the uncertainty of whether or not an elected official at the end is going to approve a project where someone has, spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars during the planning process. So I think a lot of it has increased uncertainty, the whole uncertainty with interest rates, all of those things together have added to the increased costs, for sure.
Hi, thank you both for your testimony. Good to see you. I just saw you, Anne Marie. Michelle, and I'm going to ask you a question that we've talked about a lot, so probably know what's coming. Can you just expand on the impact of rising cost on nonprofit developers and how that is impacting the industry? We've had some testimony on that in prior hearings, specifically on, city contracts and the like. But in general, it's an issue. So would love to, hear your thoughts on that.
Rising costs specifically of the affordable housing?
Yes, as it relates to nonprofit developers.
Well, I mean, Fifth Avenue Committee, we build 100% affordable housing, and we're often trying to build the most deeply affordable housing, which means we're layering multiple sources of subsidy or financing in order to reach the most in need. And so when the costs go up, it just means we got to go out and seek more subsidy dollars in order to reach those in need. And so that means the project takes longer as well. Going back to Layla's question, I mean, it's a difficult
impact
cycle.
on the industry, though, on a nonprofit.
Well, the impact in the industry is that the pipelines are getting longer, the needs are growing, and we're trying to, put our finger in a dike, basically, and, whether it's homelessness or, housing cost burden. And, for organizations like Fifth Avenue Committee, we have the benefit of having earned income from developer fees and property management fees cross-subsidizing the other charitable aspects of our mission. And so when you can't rely on those earned income sources, that means that you are not able to cross-subsidize the other sources of your mission, and that's a huge problem.
Michelle, how would you respond to were you here when the council members testified about how they're needed to represent the interests of their community? As a community-based organization, how would you respond to them? How would you counter their concerns that if we change the member deference capacity?
I mean, I think that comprehensive planning can do that as well. Right. I think that I think the biggest issue that most legitimate issue that most council members are trying to represent in the process is investment in infrastructure in some way for their communities. And that looks different in different communities.
Those are the ones that are for development.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's why I say legitimate concerns, right? I'm not talking about like.
We're talking about the other ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, I think that we need to find a process that balances borough and citywide concerns over the more parochial concerns in that case.
Do you think extending the term limits by 4 years would help that?
I think it could. I think that there are some council members who may not get a ULURP in their district for many, many years. And the first one may not be all that controversial. And I mean, I spend a fair amount of time helping council members understand the process and like the power that they have and how to wield it early.
I have one more question, if that's okay for Anne Marie. I'm curious, we've heard a lot about builder remedy and fast track ideas, and I think a lot of them are really compelling. The nexus with fair housing, have you all put thought into how there's a complexity there of kind of where you set that threshold, as Howard was talking about, and then how you track that threshold over time and have it be dynamics, because it is going to shift and the percentages can change very easily with even just one project in neighborhoods that have had very little housing. So have you all put thought into just what the right threshold should even be in a fair housing framework that has a fast track?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to design this. And frankly, every state that has implemented something like this, they've had to, go back and adjust it and figure out how it works or doesn't work. And I do think we decided to latch on to the fair housing framework that just passed in the city council, frankly, partly because it's something that we all just passed, we all just agreed to. And I think that's a value set that, was very present in City of Yes, and this was a big follow-up. So one, I think that you need something that's legible. You need something that has enough popularity and the value is there. I think exactly, that legislation hasn't fully gone into effect yet. So I think there's a huge amount of work of how you set that and what the threshold is. That frankly is going to take some time to and going back and figuring out how it works or not. But that as something to anchor to and a framework. I think one lesson learned actually from other states that have created a separate appeals process, a whole separate board, is that level of complexity, like a whole new process to set targets, is very messy and isn't necessarily working very well. The best we can do of using the tools that we have, using the Euler process that we have and the fair housing framework that we have, and trying to create something that is simple and then also that we can sort of correct for as we go, is sort of just been the guiding principle with a lot of details to figure out still.
Feel free to ignore this question, but would that also apply to the recommendations from Controller Lander, which would also, I think, create some new processes? Would you also sort of say similarly that by creating new processes, that would not what you would
assembly idea.
recommend? I'm sorry?
Meaning the assembly idea?
Citizens.
Yeah.
The Citizens Assembly.
Yeah, Citizens Assembly.
Yeah, I have talked to their team about some of that. I do think that does feel very complicated and very challenging to me, that particular layer. I actually think that citizens assembly idea and sort of this idea that we should do engagement, kind of approach it more the way we do jury duty, for example. That's actually something that we worked in to a different type of our recommendation of how we should rethink about the process of community boards and borough president input in a way. But I do think that there's something that doesn't quite connect for me for that part of their recommendation. But as they said, and as I've talked to them a lot, I think like this baseline idea that the fair housing framework is a backstop and is something that I think you've seen a lot of people agree on, is the right place to start, and try to not overcomplicate something to start.
Of course, everybody would love another form of jury duty.
What?
That would be welcome. Any other questions? Thank you both for the panel. I appreciate it. Our next would be Carl Henry Caesar and Benji Ross. You sure? Yeah.
All right. Good evening, members of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Benji Ross. I'm a research and advocacy intern with the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA, PCAC. Created by the legislator in 1981, PCAC is the official voice of MTA riders. PCAC exists to fight for better service for every rider across the system. So why am I here today talking about housing? Excellent transit is the key to plentiful housing, and plentiful housing is the key to excellent transit. People want to live where there is good transit. Unfortunately, they are too often priced out. Car-centric requirements for new housing dramatically increase costs, reduce the amount of housing that can be built, and disincentivizes residents to use our city's greatest asset, our robust transit system. New York City's housing crisis results from an incredible deficit of homes, 473,000 according to the Regional Plan Association. To realistically build the homes needed to resolve this crisis, we need to plan around transit. We have 4 recommendations for the Charter Revision Commission. 1, expand zoning for accessibility to apply to developments within a larger radius of all subway and rail stations and extend it to include bus stops. Allowing more developers than just those within a close distance of stations to pitch in on accessibility projects and other station improvements is a great way to solve 2 problems at once. 2, create a comprehensive citywide plan incorporating transit. New York City is defined by 2 things, our housing density and our transit system. Creating a citywide plan that addresses our dire need for more housing, while encouraging residents to utilize transit is critical to solving our housing crisis and cementing a stable future for mass transit. For example, our analysis showed that City of Yes will eventually bring increased daily ridership by up to 97,000 daily riders, bringing in an additional $304 million annually in the next 15 years in subway and bus operating funds, just from the new housing. 3, streamline projects that achieve citywide goals. Streamlining developments that eases our housing shortfall and addresses community needs will save time and money. With 146,000 New York City public school students experiencing homelessness last year, we do not have the time to wait. Curtailing council member deference, reforming the ULERP process, and rationalizing environmental review will go a long way towards letting New York City meet New Yorkers' needs. 4, eliminate parking minimums citywide. Car-centric cities like Minneapolis and Austin have already eliminated parking minimums. In the most transit-rich city in the Western Hemisphere, with an acute housing shortage, there should be no reason for developers to be legally required to replace housing with off-street parking. Continuing to build car-centric infrastructure makes transit and our housing cost crisis worse. The housing crisis is the defining crisis of New York City today, but we have the tools to fight it. Even after City of Yes, our zoning to text today looks more like Houston than it does like Houston. This is the greatest city on earth, and New York City needs to start planning like it's New York City. Thank you.
Thank you. Best clothing line of the night. Please continue.
Sure. So folks,
Thank you
good
so much.
evening. My name is Carl Henry Cesar, and I am the chairperson of Brooklyn Community Board 14. And so I am testifying here today to raise concerns with proposals to merge the community board and borough president review process in ULURP. The three concerns are: number one, said proposal diminishes the community voice and also provides the sense that it could be devalued. Number two, said proposal provides an incentive to politicize the appointment of community board members. And then proposal number three, concern number three is that this proposal is chasing the wrong outcome in ULURP, which is speed at the cost of quality. So regarding point number one, as you're all aware, ULURP provides 60 days for community boards and then 30 days for the borough president. The concern is that by merging this, you are giving people who share their concerns with community boards the opinion and the appearance that their voice only matters at the borough level. It doesn't matter at the individual level. So that's not good, because there's already a lot of concerns at the city level that the city is not listening to their voice. Concern number two is that per the city charter, borough presidents already appoint community board members. And so with this proposal of combining the community board and the borough president ULURP review, you are raising the specter that borough presidents could have an incentive to appoint people to give them support for ULURP review as opposed to appointing people because it's at the best benefit for the respective community board. And for number three, the concern is that there's a narrative that the ULURP process takes too long, and one of the culprits is because of the community review process. So given that it can take decades and at least a year and a half, there's a danger that a process that can take at most 90 days and makes up less than 17% of the review is somehow the culprit. And so these are the concerns that I have with the proposal of merging the community board and the borough president review process within ULURP to just sit under the borough president. And so I thank you very much for listening, and thank you for taking your time, because I know it's cold up there and you guys are freezing and it's been 3.5 hours. I'm good, but I know you're freezing. So thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate it. And the best shirt of the night.
Yeah.
Any questions for the panel?
I do have a question for you. I think you're the first community board member that spoke tonight, so thank you. What would you suggest to community boards that are not doing their fair share in this housing crisis? Like, what would be a solution you would put forward?
So I think the first thing would be the painful conversation of going to them and asking them what they think their fair share is, because there are 56 community boards, right? And so there are some community boards that felt insulted by Chair Garodnick saying that what they did during City of Yes Housing Opportunity was community engagement, where if you do the math, it averaged out to 2 or 3 meetings per community board. That doesn't feel like engagement. That feels more like we came to talk to you versus like we came to engage with you regularly. And so to your point about fair share, I think the first thing would be having to speak with each of those community boards, which does take a lot of time and investment, and I understand that, but it would be sitting down with each of the community boards and saying, hey, right now from where certain folks are at a city level, they believe that the district and the community board are not doing their fair share for housing. What do you think, right? And then having that conversation, number one, and then number two, because there's so many advocacy groups that have that housing information, right, between DCP and these other organizations that are here, continuing those conversations and then saying, hey, this is what the need is. This is what the city says is needed. This is what you are saying, you who live on the ground need. What comes in?
I'm just going to jump in for a second because I hear more process as a solution. I'm a fellow Brooklynite. That conversation's been going on for 30 years in these communities.
Yes.
that have not had additional housing put there. I'm just saying that,
I
right?
understand.
I don't,
Mhm.
so I'm just trying to explain the dilemma that I'm digesting too on this.
Yes, yes.
And that what we're all trying to digest. So thanks for your feedback.
Yes, yes, and I thank you for sharing that, because yes, like the conflict and the pain that you're describing, yes, right? Like that's one of the challenges of balancing the needs of people who've been there with the greater picture, right? So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, folks.
Next up is Gabriel Turzo and Simeon Bankoff. They'll be followed by Roberta Gratz and Kimberly Cruz. How are you? Please begin.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Gabriel Turzo, and I'm the second vice chair of Manhattan Community Board 6, which represents 155,000 New Yorkers in Manhattan Community District 6. Community Board 6 has a long history of advocating for affordable housing within our East Midtown district. Rather than opposing new housing construction, we actively seek more affordable housing options. While advocating for affordable housing by working closely with applicants, agency partners, and our elected officials, ULURP formalizes this collaboration and ensures that there's an opportunity to address community concerns. A recent example of this successful partnership is the Spark Kips Bay ULURP application, which involved redeveloping city-owned property in our district. Through collaboration between the applicant, our city council member, and Manhattan Community Board 6, the project was able to address multiple needs within the district. While the project did not ultimately include housing, community input through ULURP led to the preservation of several hundred units of affordable student housing. And furthermore, thanks to our consistent advocacy, the city committed to developing a comprehensive housing plan for Manhattan Community District 6. And, in other words, we don't want to be protected from development. We are seeking development. But some may seek to dispense with or significantly weaken ULURP for the sake of expediency. But to community boards, who are the first point of contact with their city government that many New Yorkers have, we see ULURP as a critical mechanism for better decision-making through public input. Local residents possess valuable insights into what works and what doesn't work in their communities, and we can share with our elected officials. Public input leads to better designs, more thoughtful zoning changes, and development that complements rather than conflicts with our neighborhoods. While many competing voices must be heard in land use decisions, the voice of New York City's communities must always be among them. Community boards offer a vital venue for the public's voice to be heard and shared, ensuring that New Yorkers have a seat at the table. We look forward to working with our council members to maintain and enhance our residential community. Members of this Charter Reform Commission, we ask that you preserve New Yorkers' seat at the table. Thank you.
Hello. Turning it on. Okay. Hello, I'm Simeon Bankoff, a historic preservation and community development consultant currently working with the Campaign for a Livable City. Roberta Gratz will be coming up. Is the convener of this campaign, and we'll talk a little more about the campaign. Thank you to the Commission for giving us this opportunity to share our views. As we are all aware, and as we've discussed greatly, New York is in an affordable housing crisis. The solution, we believe, is not to remove all regulations on development, but to encourage it to be done in a thoughtful, mindful manner. Development may be appropriate in certain contexts, but we cannot forget the importance of the city that exists. Preservation of our city keeps New Yorkers in their homes. It keeps them connected to the essential amenities that make communities livable, such as the network of parks, grocery stores, and reliable transportation that make a house a home, and we must ensure that these networks are kept in place. Our proposals are aimed at ensuring that what we lose is fully replaced. All too often, and Roberta will talk about this, we see tenants being forced out of their homes only to have the sites replaced with fewer units at a far higher price. Removing essential affordable housing stock and replacing with fewer, more profitable units is counter to the interests of the city, but currently our policies do nothing to stop it. The Rent Guidelines Board reports that since 2010, an average of 729 Class A buildings and 1,500 units of Class A housing have applied for demolition permits annually. Additionally, since 1994, there have been estimated loss of over 150,000 rent-stabilized units. That's an average loss of over 5,000 rent-stabilized units per year. Even if only 10% of those units of the 1,500 units demolished were in some kind of rent stabilization, replacing them and only them would still add 750 units a year, or cut the annual losses to rent-stabilized apartments by 15%. We propose that the apartment buildings only approve construction permits if no apartments are lost. To ensure that buildings are not demolished without a replacement plan, there should be a short look-back period, so that if an owner tears a building down, they can't get permits unless they build something with the same number of units or more that existed before the demolition. Secondly, we propose the city apply a demolition fee to projects where housing units will be lost. Under our proposal, this fee would help defray the cost of replacing those units within the community district where the building is located. The fees would go into a capital reserve fund established specifically for that community district, and the funds would be used exclusively for affordable housing development. Finally, the campaign also supports the Community Land Act, land banking and related bills, expanding the certificate of no harassment programs to ensure that New Yorkers can remain in their homes, and enhancing the city's commitment to a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction through the permanent allocation of sufficient funding so that all low-income tenants facing eviction can have access to an attorney. Thank you for your time. It's much warmer up here than it is in there.
Thank you so much. Any questions for the panel? Much for your testimony. Next up, we have Roberta Gratz and Kimberly Cruz. Will be followed by Tara Duvivier, and then we'll move to online testimony. Thank you so much.
I am Roberta Brandy Scratz, and it's a pleasure to join you today. I've spent my entire career as an urbanist, first as a newspaper reporter, author of 6 books, and a member of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Tonight, I'm here on behalf of the Campaign for a Livable City. We are a new initiative advocating for the balanced approach to planning and development that promotes responsible new development and ensures neighborhood continuity. We are losing affordable housing at an alarming rate. Existing affordable units are being torn down and replaced by towers with fewer units and few affordable. The city is losing small apartment buildings and renovated tenements to buildings for the rich. It's happening all over the city. In Yorkville, 43 affordable units and 4 commercial units at 202 East 75th at 3rd were replaced with 38 units and no ground floor commercial. Similar projects all over Yorkville. In Harlem, a landlord was sent to jail after he nearly killed tenants in an attempt to force them out so the rent-stabilized units could be upgraded to luxury housing. 15 West 96th Street, a 321-foot tower with 21 condos, replaced 3 landmark quality 5-story townhouses with 30 rental units. Height and density are not the same thing. With all the new high-rise towers all over Manhattan, for example, including the super talls, all 12 of Manhattan's community districts experienced a net loss of 37,466 affordable units between 2007 and 2020, and that's with the new units at Hudson Yards and the Upper West Side waterfront. So I'm here today to say we cannot just build our way out of this problem. If demolition is necessary, then the replacement building should at least be required on site to contain the same number of lost units. This commission has a unique opportunity to prevent the diminution of existing number of apartments. You can stand for affordability, preservation, and livability. I thank you for your attention.
Hello. My name is Kimberly Cruz. Daja hao or Sure Kungli Shin. Me llamo Kimberly Cruz y soy de Queens. And I say this because at this very moment, it's historical that we can say Ubuntu, which is that sometimes translated as I am because we are, and also I am because you are. And life is complicated, and we can't stick to these words called affordability, because sometimes affordability means fixing the things that actually exist in front of you and New Yorkers who are dying from immunocompromised conditions, where these conditions in their housing units are leading them to the hospital that we don't have infrastructure for across all the cities. So Ubuntu, that I am because we are. So every time that we're thinking about our community boards, they're not our local government. We're kind of piecing together local government here and there, saying borough president, city council, and community board. That's not a local government. That's not my representation. They don't know my day-to-day. They're not walking the same lines I'm going to. I've seen the community boards. They choose them, the same appointees. But why don't we have technocratic citizens' assemblies with the people's assemblies attached to it to remove the shite of our city, right? City services that are not working, but they keep growing for some reason when the people are not asking for it. Health, why don't we have a public health official team that's funded, that's ready for measles? Insurance, there's a lot of fraud in these insurance claims and our elderly are getting hurt. Transportation, there are a lot of disability claims that people don't understand. I'm wearing my sunglasses because the blind are coming. My generation that has been staring at these phones since they were 8 years old, they're coming. And our city services will then in 10 years say, oh, now we have a blind population. Or maybe we have a deaf population because we've been using our AirPods for the last 15 to 20 years with no regulation. So we should have sign language all the time. Not when we can fund it, but all the time. Because my generation, I'm 26. In front of us is not a person of my age. In front of us, I hope someone that's menstruating is caring about my privacy, because federally, we are not being seen. Our neuroprivacy, the charter can add something, just like Connecticut, just like Colorado. We, you and I, are the local government that we're piecing together in this housing crisis, transportation shite, city services, health, insurance, technology, transportation, and education, because the federal government is defunding our children's education. I went to Yale, I went to Bronx Science. I don't think people are going to look like me. So I'm sitting here, Ubuntu, please create a local government and let us fund it, us. I'm just tired, guys.
Thank you so much.
I'm tired. This is too much. We are sitting here.
Much for your testimony.
This
I greatly
is a circus and bread situation.
Next is Tara Duvivier.
Good evening. Thank you, commissioners, for the opportunity to submit testimony to this Charter Revision Commission. My name is Tara Duvivier. I'm Senior Planner at Pratt Center for Community Development. Pratt Center for Community Development works for a more just, equitable, and sustainable New York City. Our land use and housing justice work ranges from facilitating community plans for neighborhoods across the city to policy reports on strategies to ensure that value created by city rezonings is captured for public good. We call on this commission to prioritize democracy, participatory planning, and racial and economic justice as it considers revisions to our city's charter to improve government transparency and responsiveness to address our city's housing crisis. Specifically, we urge this commission to consider revisions to the city charter that mandate the city develop and maintain a comprehensive plan that centers racial, economic, health, and climate equity and ensures intentional, robust, and representative community engagement. Pratt Center is a member of the Thriving Communities Coalition, A citywide movement of more than 15 grassroots organizing, advocacy, policy, and technical assistance groups advocating for a more equitable, participatory, and comprehensive approach to city planning. We echo the testimony of our TCC partners, including ANHD, and recommendations to mandate an enforceable, equity-based, comprehensive plan and enforce the city's fair housing plan. New York City has never adopted a comprehensive plan to guide land use and resource allocation decisions for present and future needs. The city instead takes, an ad hoc approach to planning through neighborhood and developer-initiated rezoning subject to ULURP, which limits consideration of broader community context and needs. Communities and elected officials must respond to these proposals without any coherent guiding framework, with inadequate resources and under a highly contentious process. Our communities, including community boards and grassroots groups, are under-resourced in evaluating these proposals. They rely on each other and in some cases outside consultants to assist in understanding and evaluating these applications. The role of the public in land use processes, while advisory, does have an impact, particularly with their city council reps who are elected by and serve these communities. Community input has helped deepen projects' affordability levels and secures funding for schools, parks, public housing, and tenant protections. Communities should not have to rely on piecemeal negotiations to secure public resources, but absent comprehensive and equitable planning, ULURP is a tool for communities to inform and advocate for their future. Several of the proposals before this commission focus on streamlining ULURP to reduce the role of community boards or city council, or to fast-track projects on city-owned land with income-restricted housing. Given the lack of resources and other community issues that community board members must attend to, communities are already working on a tight timeline with the public review process. For example, with City of Yes for economic opportunity and housing opportunity rezoning proposals, less than half of the community board submitted recommendations before the City Planning Commission hearings for these proposals. I've submitted a full testimony already, but we just really would like to encourage you all to consider our our outline proposal for comprehensive planning, and again, to carefully consider what you would do moving forward with regard to housing affordability. Especially, we know that affordable housing isn't exactly affordable, so please, this idea of fast tracking, we don't think is the best idea. We do think that we really need to encourage and support more community involvement and engagement in these processes and not reducing their role. Thank you.
Questions? So much. Thank you. We're now going to move to online testimony. Is Christine Peel online?
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. Please begin.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, commissioners and chair, for your service and your robust conversation and engagement with the hearing tonight, and for the opportunity to testify. I'm CEO and Executive Director of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. We promote and protect affordable homeownership so that working and middle-class New York families can build strong, stable communities. You've heard a lot of great suggestions tonight, but I wanted to highlight a couple. Taking off some of the recommendations from the Thriving Communities Coalition around a comprehensive citywide planning framework. I think it's really important to be able to proactively invest infrastructure in neighborhoods, especially the neighborhoods that have been home to historically Black and Latino homeownership, with the infrastructure investments that they need to be able to receive more housing. I think communities want more affordable homeownership. They want more housing. They want multifamily homeownership, and they want the investment in their sewer system. They want to be able to move away from a combined water and sewer system to be able to support new housing. They want the transportation opportunities and a comprehensive citywide planning process with real short, medium, and long-term targets and accountability, as Michelle mentioned, would be a real way to put that commitment in action and plan for the investments in communities alongside the plan for new housing. And again, in a way to address citywide needs. We think this is the only way that we're going to be able to develop more affordable homeownership by getting more communities on board with more housing. We also think it's critical to be proactively doing citywide comprehensive planning to address the real risk of the climate crisis. A lot of the neighborhoods that were hit by the foreclosure crisis, where we've done a lot of our work, are impacted by the climate change with groundwater flooding, rainfall flooding, and obviously sea level rise. And again, we need to be able to plan for the impacts of climate change on these neighborhoods while also understanding that we need new housing. We talked about the ways to streamline ULURP for deeply affordable housing. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the fair housing framework needs to be enforced and needs to have teeth. I think that makes a lot of sense. And Commissioner White will not be surprised to hear me talk about the need for the timely execution of housing contracts. We know that the nonprofit sector is essentially financing the government to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of multiple years. And I think charter reform and revision would allow us to charge the city financing fees and late fees for the amount that we need to front the city to perform our services on behalf of New Yorkers. So we'll submit a more comprehensive testimony. Thank you for extending the time of the hearing tonight and your service, and look forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for Ms. Peel? Next is Susan Niall. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. Susan, Nial. No? Next up is Nick. Next up is Mark Weller. No. Next up is Alex Maza. Albin Henneberger. Lo Vander Valk. Lo Vander Valk. V-A-L-K.
Yes, my name is Lo Vandervalk. I'm representing Carnegie Hill Neighbors, in the Upper East Side. We are very concerned about this. The current I can't say proposals being considered because they haven't been fully outlined, but we know that the direction will be for a greater centralization of decision-making in terms of future housing, especially affordable housing, and that this will tend to short circuit or that the streamlining will come at the cost of community input. So we want to go on record as saying that we think community inputs are very valuable and should not be compromised. And I will issue a fuller statement, but I have greatly appreciated the complexity of the issues involved and discussed here, and the balancing, obviously, of the citywide concerns and the local concerns. But we think mechanisms need to be articulated so that when a proposal is being proposed for the November elections, that there can be a great deal of clarity as to what the new proposals really will entail. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Valk? Next up is Ken A.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please continue. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
great. So I would like to express a lot of support for streamlining the process to fast track housing in every neighborhood. Builders Remedy is probably a great tool for balancing the member difference issue, where potentially we could implement a mechanism where council members who are using a member deference as a blockage to housing, to kind of give them the stick that the builders remedy could provide. I would also recommend and support that you think about landmarks preservation committee to be advisory in nature, as opposed to being a veto when it comes to housing matters. If not, then they must consider housing matters in the consideration of the decision-making process. I do recall South Seaport being an example of where pretty petty aesthetic considerations for being overrated, too much emphasis on petty aesthetics over the real need for housing in the city. Yeah, and I will see the rest of my time, and but just generally just fast track housing, we really need it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Next, Maria Danzillo.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair and members of the Commission for your service, and thank you so much for staying so late tonight. I'm Executive Director of One City Rising, a nonpartisan good government grassroots group. We actually are grassroots. We do not accept any money from special interest groups. We are fully funded by our members. We have several thousand members citywide. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, an attorney, and a mother of three who raised my three children here in New York City, and I'm deeply committed to a positive future for our city so that it is a thriving place for my children and future generations. One City Rising members include people from both political parties. We're not a political club, as well as many independents. We believe in listening to each other respectfully, and we look for common ground on what is needed to improve government in New York City. Our members hold a wide range of political views, and we view a successful meeting, and we have many meetings, as where no one actually kicks a chair or runs out of the room and threatens to quit our group. We disagree on many things, but there is one issue where our members are clear, and that is the need for electoral reform, and specifically the need to franchise every voter, including the 1 million independent voters in New York City, through open primaries. 23 of the 30 largest cities in the country have open primaries. It is a clear and undisputed fact that leaders are elected in the primaries, yet New York City primaries have perhaps the lowest or among the lowest voter turnouts anywhere in the whole country. It is a clear and glaring problem, and we appreciate that this commission has been taking a serious look at this issue and hopefully will make a recommendation to finally open our primaries. We have 5 million voters in New York City, and we're looking at turnout under 10%, which means the vast majority of New Yorkers are not the ones who are electing our leaders. This is not representative democracy, and it is a crisis. Open primaries will fix this by first franchising the million independent voters, and second, allowing every voter to participate in crucial primaries regardless of their party affiliation. In cities that have open primaries, voter turnout has significantly improved because people participate when they feel they have a voice. We can't continue to just ask people to register in the party that has the power in a particular district. It's just not fair to them. There are positions that one or the other party might take that might prevent someone in good conscience from joining that party. We don't ask people to switch their religious affiliations. We shouldn't ask them to switch their party affiliations. We believe that open primaries will inspire and motivate people to vote in general elections, where turnout in New York City is also abysmally low. For example, in the 2024 general election, which was a presidential year, New York City was 49 out of 50 states in low voter turnout. New York voters need to be given a reason to vote, and we can do that.
Time.
Yeah, sure. May I please have another 30 seconds?
Sure.
Thank you. New Yorkers need to be given a reason to vote, and we can do that by doing what every other large city has done. Let me also mention that voters vote with their feet. We have a city and state that is losing our tax base and at the fastest rate in the country, and a city with the highest tax rate and highest inflation in the country. Open primaries will make it possible for every New Yorker to have a say in who is going to lead us out of this. One other issue I just want to mention is that the primaries are held at the end of June, which is a very hard time for many families in New York City. And we would also respectfully ask the commission to consider moving the primary date to either before Memorial Day or after Labor Day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Next is Frampton Tolbert.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Frampton Tolbert, the Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. HCC is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods, and we represent a constituency of more than 500 community partner organizations to help them preserve the places that matter to them. Part of the Charter Commission's role is to review existing land use processes and propose changes. We strongly support new housing and believe that preservation should be seen as a tool to make that happen, especially through adaptive reuse projects and contextual development. We cannot build ourselves out of this problem. As Dan Garodnick has said, 90% of buildings that will exist in 2025 already exist, so we need to incentivize their reuse for housing, especially affordable housing. We do understand that the Commission may make changes to the propose changes to the ULURP process. We oppose any plan that would diminish or eliminate public participation. Efforts to shut out the public out of the process that shapes their lives and opportunities follows a dangerous local and national trend of dismantling civic structures and perpetuating the idea that only the wealthy and connected can or should make decisions for us. HCC is a longtime proponent of public processes. For more than 50 years, we have reviewed all major applications to the Landmarks Commission because we believe community input makes our cities stronger. We have seen time and time again how public testimony has added vital information to the public record and helped shape these projects into better versions of themselves. We also say, I'll just lastly say, we believe that there may need to be an improvement to the ULURP process so that small-time developers and property owners can create projects and more housing in a process that mostly benefits now large developers who have the time and resources to fund these projects and timelines. But the solution is not to stifle community participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Any questions? All right, next is Melanie Westlock.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Melanie Westlock. I am a lifelong New Yorker, a parent, and a small business owner. I'm also a proud member of One City Rising, a grassroots organization of bipartisan New Yorkers throughout New York City, and we're working to support common sense policies. I'm here to speak about my support of getting open primaries on the ballot. Open primaries are a system where voters are required to be affiliated with a political party to participate in primary elections, as Maria mentioned. I believe that they are especially important in a diverse and politically dynamic city like New York, and it would create a more inclusive and democratic electoral process. Here in New York City, many registered voters identify as independents, and under the current closed primary system, these voters are excluded from helping to choose the candidates in a major party primary, and these primaries often determine the eventual winner in a heavily one-party district. Currently, voter turnout in New York is really shameful. It's like 10%. Allowing all voters to participate in primaries can lead to higher voter turnout and greater civic engagement. Often primaries are encouraged, open primaries would encourage candidates to appeal to a broader range of constituents rather than just catering to their own party's base. Candidates would then have to consider the perspectives and priorities of all voters. This could result in a more moderate and consensus-driven leader, and they would be better equipped to govern a diverse and complex city like New York. As a business owner, I have a personal stake in the success of our city, which depends on proper representation. Open primaries would foster an environment where independent voters would finally have a voice. Open primaries promote fairness and transparency. They empower voters rather than parties. In a city like New York, embracing open primaries would be a step toward a more equitable democracy instead of a one-party rule. In conclusion, open primaries would lead to a greater voter participation, to more balanced representation and a more robust democratic process. New York City is one of the few major cities not to have open primaries. We pride ourselves in being a leader and an example of a great city. It's time our primaries live up to this expectation. Thank you so much for the time tonight, and I know it's a late evening, so thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate it. Any questions? Finally, Michael Lewin.
Hi. I'd like to thank you for your service tonight, first of all. I'm a law professor at Torah Law School. I live in Midtown. I'm a member of Open New York, but I don't speak for them. And I don't get warrant that they would necessarily agree with everything I'm about to say. First of all, I would like to endorse Anne Marie's Gray's call for fast tracking housing, especially affordable housing, especially in areas that haven't been adding much housing. But really the best thing about being able to testify late in a meeting is that instead of just reiterating what other people have said, a person can respond to things that other people have said, which I actually think is more interesting. So one argument again that seems to be used against streamlining is this concern that, well, builders are just going to have to tear down existing units to build new housing. And I don't really find that argument that persuasive. And the reason is, it seems to me that when new housing is proposed on vacant lots, it gets the same type and maybe even the same volume as quote unquote community resistance that tearing down older housing does. So for example, there is a development at 250 Water Street that's been taking years to live. It was on a vacant lot. But it's still taken years to litigate because there's been this kind of quote unquote community opposition. Another argument is, well, it's much more important to have quote unquote more community input than to have new housing. But I'm a little skeptical of that argument for two reasons. First of all, the people who testify in these kind of meetings aren't necessarily representative of the public. There's actually been a lot of research saying that people who testify in zoning relating meetings tend to be very unrepresentative of the public. They're older, they're wider, they're more likely to be homeowners. I think there's a book, I forget who wrote, but I think there's a book called Neighborhood Defenders by Catherine Einstein that goes through a lot of detail about this. And second, sort of community input creates a sort of individual rationality, collective irrationality situation. That is to say, it may be rational for each individual neighborhood to exclude housing for a variety of reasons, but it's still not rational for the city as a whole. Someone else mentioned concerns about infrastructure. I just say, given New York's high taxes, if new infrastructure let me rephrase that. If more taxes and more government spending led to more housing, we would be building housing at a faster pace in low tax states, which of course is sort of the opposite of reality. So on that note, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your testimony. With that, I believe we are concluded. The next public hearing of the commission will be in Brooklyn on May 19th. If I could have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Some of us have moved with their feet. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? So
Aye.
all right, we are adjourned. The next meeting will be at Meg Rivers College in Foundry Auditorium at 16 Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn. And we almost made it to the end.